Hey guys, this is going to be my entire review for the Dark Deku arc, or as the My Hero Wiki says, the Tartarus Escapees arc. But this is going to be my reviews for chapter 307 to 328, and even if you're not interested in watching this whole thing, this is also just a good video to put on the background while you're like studying or working or something, you know, just some background noise. And there's going to be a little bit missing from the end because I had to have surgery during that time, but this is pretty much the whole thing, so enjoy guys. So in this chapter, the Ketsubutsu students are coming back into the story. We're mainly seeing Shindo and Tatami here, but it's implied that the other students, Makabe and Itajiro, are in the vicinity as well, because they're relaying to Shindo on his communicator that like Muscular is nearby, and of course we'll get to that. But it's been quite a while since we've seen these characters, because the last time we saw them was the provisional license exam arc. And I guess this is showing us where Izuku currently is, or where he wound up during this 1 month time skip since he left UA in the previous chapter. And that's, I guess, the town that Ketsubutsu High is located in, possibly, because we'll see Shindo telling those civilians to go to the shelter that's located in Ketsubutsu High, which I guess is showing us that this is like a recurring thing going on in Japan right now, given the shaky state of things with just society in general, because we saw this was happening with UA as well. At least the families of the students were moving to UA. We saw Bakugo and Izuku's mom going there in the previous chapter, because now it's going to become some sort of makeshift shelter. And I guess it's happening all over Japan, because like I said, the shaky state of things, and given that you know, they're down a whole bunch of heroes, and I guess that's also strengthened in this chapter, the fact that they're down so many heroes, because that they're sending Shindo and Tatami to go deal with this one area of the city here. And that's also why we get like the cynical response from the civilians here responding to the help from Shindo and Tatami. They're like, you're just kids, we're not gonna listen to you. You know, we've been doing just fine defending ourselves from looters and everything. This is another recurring thing. We've seen that civilians and shop owners and people like that in general were just kind of like defending themselves from like villains or criminals and whatnot, in lieu of like the shortage of heroes and just kind of like the downfalls of heroes in general, with them just, I guess in a way, kind of losing the war or not winning it, I'll say. And also all of the dirty laundry coming out with Endeavor and Hawks and whatnot. So with the reintroduction of Shindo and Tatami, we're also finding out that they're third years now. When they were originally in the story back in the provisional license exam, they were second years. So I guess this is indicating that the new school year has started, meaning that technically we're seeing what could be considered second year Izuku here. And like I said in my video yesterday, this is something that we've been waiting for a very long time. It seems like they've been in their first year for like 7 years at this point, but we finally have second year Izuku, or just second year class 1A, but just not the way that we wanted, or at least I wanted. I was hoping for a second sports festival, but it seems like that was probably going to be a little too good to be true. But anyway, Muscular is showing up in this chapter right in front of Shindo and Tatami. He is like the escaped villain that's terrorizing this city right here. And I'm pretty sure this is also what we were seeing at the end of the previous chapter when Izuku was looking down on the city and we saw like those buildings collapsing, and he was like, that's a big villain. Guess he was referring to Muscular there. And wow, he's probably the most imposing he's ever been in the series right now, because we're actually seeing him in an environment that was outside of, you know, the handful of chapters that he was in back in the training camp arc. And he's just going through buildings and he's looking like the Hulk. He's just really powerful, as we knew, but we mainly just needed to see him in a different environment, like I said, and going against people outside of Izuku to really establish that he is as powerful as this chapter is making him out to be. And I also rewatched and read the initial fight between Izuku and Muscular, and he was still pretty much painted to be as powerful as he is here. Like, he took a 100% smash from Izuku and kind of like shook it off. I mean, but as far as like taking 100% smashes from like villains or adversaries that we've seen in the series so far, he's like at the top of the list of being the most impressive, I guess, of taking them. And don't forget that Izuku had to dig deep to take down Muscular. Like one of the deepest diggings that we've ever seen him pull out in the series, just to take down this one guy. But let me also put it out there that the 1,000,000% smash that Izuku used to take down Muscular originally, I understand that that's not literally 1,000,000%. I mean, I know that we don't have to talk about this, but maybe there's some new people that aren't necessarily sure what that meant or just want to know my opinion on it. I'm pretty sure that was just like a hyperbolic statement used to make that seem more compelling, I guess. It was Izuku essentially tapping into the Vestige's power to give him just a little more oomph, you know, similar to what we've seen All Might do previously in the series, or at least it's made more clear in the anime. But I doubt it was 1,000,000 because he probably would have destroyed the continent or something if it was. It was just enough to take down Muscular with one solid strike. But speaking of his durability, he's straight up taking Shindo's best shots here. I mean, he initially just shakes off his like vibration quirk attack, but then Shindo like uses his named attack, and even that is not enough. Going back to me saying that, like, you know, Muscular took a 100% smash and kind of shook it off. So I doubt Shindo is as strong or stronger than that. But after Muscular takes this to the face by adding more fibers to him, he's about to just finish Shindo off. And then our boy Izuku comes back into the picture and gives Muscular a smash, saves the day, grabs Shindo, and he's looking pretty cool here. I likened him to a Stain-like aesthetic in my previous reviews for 306, and he's still kind of keeping that aesthetic here. However, he has his hood on, and he's actually using the mask. And I think this might be the first time within the canon of the main storyline of the manga that he's actually put the mask on. The only other time I've personally seen him put this mask on was like in the bonus pages for the volume, when Horikoshi simply just drew what it would look like if he put the mask on. And the other time I've seen it was when he put it on in the team-up missions with Mirko, that I actually reviewed that chapter. You can check it out here. Maybe he put it on like another times, like outside of canon, but still pretty cool nonetheless. But as he's holding Shindo here, he's like, no wonder my danger sense was going haywire, referring to the 4th user of One For All's quirk that he recently picked up in the war. And then Muscular looks at him and he's like, that voice, could it be? So obviously recognizing Izuku here, the one who put him in jail. And that being said, we're gonna get a rematch now. Izuku at the, I guess, perceived peak of his power, or, you know, up until this point in the story. So on paper, like I was saying in my video yesterday, this should be way more competitive, if not favoring Izuku this time around. I mean, he has way more control over One For All, and he has all of the bonus quirks, and he has the experience and knowledge of what Muscular is like. So I guess Izuku, I don't know, maybe will mid-diff him or something. But that raises the question of, like, is Izuku okay? Like, is his body all right? How far can he go? He was like near paralysis coming out of the war, if almost assured paralysis, until something over this 1 month span happened and he's seemingly okay now. Now, like you all, I don't understand what's going on with him because it hasn't been explained, which maybe that will come into play into the next chapter. Maybe he'll have some kind of limiting factor to him, possibly. And a lot of people have been asking me, like, you know, do you think Eri maybe fixed him with her ability? And I thought that that wasn't really an option. That's why I didn't really even talk about it, because she recently used her quirk on Mirio to bring his quirk back. So that would mean that she would need more time to accumulate whatever it is that she accumulates in her horn, and maybe a month is long enough for her to like regrow it enough, for her to use it enough to heal Izuku here. But then again, I've also expressed this in previous videos that it seems kind of problematic for Horikoshi to keep going back to the well that is Eri and use her as like a problem solver. Because obviously she's done that before with the whole overhaul battle. I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it would necessarily be a good idea from a writing perspective to keep bringing her into the picture to just fix Izuku, when otherwise him having this limited factor to him would probably make the story more rich and compelling for him to maybe find another way to get around this other than just Eri just fixes everything. But then again, it could be her, maybe not, but we'll see what happens in the next chapter, because it's looking like we're absolutely gonna get Izuku versus Muscular round 2, which is going to be incredible. So picking up from the end of the previous chapter, Izuku has come in at the last second to save Shindo from Muscular, and we're seeing the continuation of that sequence, with Muscular recognizing Izuku, and then Muscular starts leaping towards him, but then Izuku notices that like he's not able to jump directly at him, but like right below him into the building, and then like he wrecks the building and causes it to fall apart. And Muscular's like, let's settle this with a rematch. So this sequence right here is is setting up the inevitable end of Muscular. Then we see Tatami making her way to where Izuku is holding Shindo, and he's like, oh, thank God, please take care of him. So now he's handing off Shindo to Tatami. So now he's evacuated. He doesn't have to worry about him, and he could just focus on Muscular. And then Tatami's like, I couldn't see because of the smoke, but his voice is pretty familiar. Who is he? Understandable that she would recognize Izuku's voice, considering that they met each other in the provisional license exam arc. Then Izuku darts away, and he says, did I overdo it? And then out of nowhere, we see the 6th user, and he like puts his arm around Izuku's shoulder and starts talking to him. And he's like, I suppose you've done enough to control the area. You use too much of your smoke screen. Don't let him turn the advantage against your favor, I suppose. So this is super interesting. So first of all, this is confirming that the 6th user's quirk is in fact a smoke quirk, but I guess it's going to be referred to as smoke screen here. And I guess this is what the majority of us expected it to be, considering it was revealed in like chapter 304, 305, I don't remember exactly, that his name was N, which apparently means smoke. So given how the naming usually goes with the heroes in My Hero, it usually refers to their abilities. Therefore, we have a smoke quirk here. And it's pretty cool, like the way that it comes off of Izuku kind of just emanates off of him, almost like I guess it's coming out of his pores or something. And it certainly brings a different type of aspect to Izuku. Like what I've been talking about the last couple of weeks, when we've been speculating about the possibility of Izuku having this quirk, it would bring him more utility, kind of like how Black Whip's brought, but this is more so from like, as the 6th user is saying, the ability to control the area by, you know, using the smoke, and it puts more advantage of situations into Izuku's favor, given that he is in control of the smoke and therefore shutting off the range of vision from his opponent. Now, the other thing is that the 6th user is like in real time communicating with Izuku without Izuku having to go into the vestige world. Pretty sure this is the first time we've ever seen this happen. This like immediately reminded me of like Dexter. If you're familiar with that show, like Dexter was able to talk to like his dead dad and like have like conversations with him. Also, of course, I'm sure this reminds you of Naruto and Kurama's later relationship in the series. And I honestly like this. I think it's pretty cool that he's able to do this, and I hope we see more of it with the other vestiges. And speaking of the vestiges, just a little update on the 2nd and 3rd users, or should I say there is no update on them. This chapter has still not given us any insight into them. We don't even have like a hint as to if he picked up their abilities or not, or what's really going on with them. And I was thinking like, oh, maybe the 2nd user or the 3rd user will just randomly show up and start talking to him the way that the 6th user is here eventually in the future, but I don't know, maybe that's just unlikely at this point. But then the 6th user continues to give Izuku some more advice, and he's like, I suppose you're relying on One for All too much. You're making avoidable accidents under its influence. You shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the other 8 generations made. Try to loosen your shoulders. Don't let the power use your body. Let your body use the power instead. Your collective quirks alone aren't enough to serve as your crutch. You value your quirks too much, I suppose. Think of them instead as more of your tools. You using those tools will get you into the right mindset. And then we see a panel of what these quirks could represent in tool, like Black Whip's representing a rope, his smoke screen representing like a smoke bomb or whatever you call it, smoke grenade, I don't know. Float representing a jetpack, and then I guess Danger Sense is being represented as like a walkie-talkie or something. Let me also point out that I was mistaken in my spoilers video yesterday. I didn't have all of the information, and I kind of rushed through stuff by just like quickly looking at the leaked panels that we got, and I didn't really put 2 and 2 together with the context that was written on the spoilers. So I just want to put that out there. Sometimes in the spoilers videos, I'll make mistakes or something, but I'll definitely, you know, correct them once I actually see the full chapter the following day. That's why I always make 2 videos. So if you're not subscribed, please subscribe, because I always make a My Hero video Thursday and Fridays for the new chapters. But it's after this where Izuku becomes unleashed, and we're really seeing him advance to the next level of not only character development, but also power development as well. And this is probably the best version of Izuku we've seen in the series so far, because like what was just established with him using the quirks as tools, that's exactly what he's doing here. He's taking a page out of Obi-Wan's book and getting the high ground with float, using smokescreen to reduce the range of vision to catch him off guard, and then using danger sense to dodge his attacks. This is another thing that I've been talking about for a while now, and it was that he's going to use danger sense in kind of like the same application as like Ultra Instinct or Observation Hockey or something like that, because it was kind of teased that it had this application to it when we saw the 4th user interacting with the 5th user in the vestige world. Then finally just uses Black Whip to constrain him, and then just throws him into like like the river. Coming into this chapter, we expected Izuku to defeat Muscular, but it was really unclear how easy it was going to be. But now it's made apparent that this is a straight up squash match. Like, Izuku is so far ahead of Muscular at this point that he pretty much has no chance. Then Izuku starts questioning Muscular's motives here. He's like, why are you doing what you're doing? Do you really have to do this? And then he's like, is there no other path for you to take? Imasuji Goto, name reveal on Muscular here. And then Muscular just pretty much establishes that, like, hey, you know what? I'm evil. I'm unredeemable. You can't talk no jutsu me. You're going to have to beat me down with brute force. And then we get the one panel where it says, if I truly understood him, maybe things would turn out different. This is a callback to chapter 305 when Izuku's talking to the Vestiges. And this statement is generally in the direction of Shigaraki, but interestingly enough, on that page of the original dialogue, we see Muscular, Stain, and Overhaul. So now that he has come back to Muscular here, could that have possibly been little foreshadowing that this is going to be like Izuku's reunion tour? Maybe, because we know that Stain is currently free. Like, he's out just like Muscular is. So maybe this means that Izuku is going to meet up with Stain again, and then maybe have a conversation with him, and then maybe Overhaul after that. Then Izuku's like, okay, well, I guess I gotta beat you down. And he's like, a rematch is pointless. And as Muscular's about to attack him, his muscle fibers start snapping. And then we're getting the explanation as to what happened at the beginning of the chapter when he wasn't able to launch at Izuku directly. And that's because when Shindo hit him with Tremoring Earthquake in the previous chapter, like face first, it did the damage already. It just took a little bit for it to show its inevitable effects. So Shindo not completely useless here. Although he did get beat down, he served his purpose and set up Izuku for this big win here, where we're seeing at the end of the chapter with Muscular's, true body exposed, Izuku hitting him with the one shot, similar to how he hit Overhaul. And we get this awesome panel from Horikoshi here, maybe top 10 in the series possibly. And yeah, that's where the chapter ends. Amazing. I love this chapter so much, giving it like an 8.5. But going a little more into this ending sequence here, not really sure how much of One For All Izuku is using at this point. It's obviously not revealed, but the last update that we got on the amount of power that Izuku could use without him like breaking his body was 45% at the point of impact, and then 30% comfortably. But given that we've had the month time skip and he seemingly has had some coaching from the Vestiges in real time, maybe he can now use more than 45. Maybe he's hitting him with like 50 or maybe 60 or something. Or this could straight up be 100, but it visibly doesn't look like 100. So the chapter is opening up with confirmation that Izuku has absolutely defeated Muscular here. At the end of the previous chapter, we saw he basically like one-shotted him with an attack similar to what he did to Overhaul. And he's turning him into, I guess, the police here or whoever the authorities are. But he's also keeping himself incognito at the same time, like still producing smoke from, the 6 users quirk that he just recently picked up. And as soon as they have Muscular, he just darts out of there. And that brings up the question, so like, why is he doing this? Well, I just think he's ultimately trying to stay, like I said, incognito at this point. I'm just assuming he's trying to get as much attention away from himself because, what's going to be talked about later on in this chapter of like Shigaraki tracking him down. So then we see him calling All Might, and he meets up with him in like this alleyway. And then All Might asks him if he has any injuries, and Izuku says, I'm uninjured. Thanks to you, I'm completely fine. And then we see those wraps around his arm unravel, and he says the support item that was delivered right before the travel restrictions were instituted. The power stabilizing mid gauntlet, I don't feel a thing thanks to it. And then All Might says, remember that this is just an endurance prototype. It's supposed to reinforce your entire arm, but it's nowhere near strong enough to withstand your power at 100%. Make sure to not overdo yourself before the final showdown. Now, as for the mid gauntlet, there's no confirmation on exactly where this thing is coming from yet, but I guess we do know that it came from overseas, considering it says the item was delivered right before travel restrictions were instituted. So in the spoilers yesterday, it was straight up said that this is coming from America. But now that we have the full chapter and the rough fan translations, no instance of America is being mentioned here. And I keep mentioning America because that's kind of important, because if you saw the My Hero 2 Heroes movie, Rebecca Shield, the daughter of David Shield, All Might's former partner from his time in America, made Izuku pretty much the same thing in that movie, except at that time it was called Full Gauntlet, and it allowed Izuku to use 30% of his power. And it had a nearly identical aesthetic, but not only that, it formed the same way that we see it forming in this chapter. So either Horikoshi is straight up trying to blend the continuity of the movies into the actual continuity of the manga. I'm not saying that the movies aren't canon, because Horikoshi himself said that they pretty much are. But that being said, it looks like Horikoshi could try to be implementing that into the main story here, like I said, or at least slowly, because, you know, America's not being mentioned, and if America's not being mentioned, then obviously Rebecca is not being mentioned at all. So I don't want to get ahead of myself or hype anybody up saying that this is absolutely tying into that stuff, meaning that like we're going to see Rebecca soon, or we're going to see David, who I think is in jail, you know, considering what happens in the movie. Spoilers. I just don't know at this point, but given that we are in the final act of the series right now, I wouldn't be surprised if, like I said, Horikoshi is just trying to tie all of these continuities and come full circle with it now. So then All Might gets a call from Hawks, and this is basically establishing what the future of this arc or the next couple chapters are going to be, where they're just trying to get Izuku to come together for this like 5-man team here to basically go after Shigaraki and All for One and try to end all of this. Where it ultimately comes down to Hawks saying that, like, I know that these are trying times for you, but I request that you work together with us. So then at this point, I guess we're going to a flashback to before Izuku left the hospital, maybe? And we're finally coming to the explanation of how Izuku is okay, or at least his body is okay. If you've been following my coverage of this series, you'll know that I've had a lot of questions about this. Given that there's been so much weight put on him damaging his body using the full power of One for All, or at least what was accessible to him, it's been built up that like, hey, he potentially could become paralyzed or just unable to use One for All anymore because of his damage accrual. And a couple chapters back, when we had a hard 1 month time skip from him leaving the hospital to him fighting Muscular, there was a lot of questions about, okay, so why is he okay? Well, it turns out, somebody in my comments section put it perfectly actually, it turns out that he's now built different. Long story short, when he accumulated a lot of those injuries, he was only at 5% of his power with One for All, and now that he can use 45%, his body has adapted, and therefore he's not as fragile or vulnerable as he was before. But more specifically, he says, in the past, you incurred injuries from within your body. This time, most of the damage was dealt externally. In addition, whether it be a side effect of your quirk, your internal structure seems to have been protected from the inside and out, i.e., you are now built different. And then he tacks on at the end, even so, you'll still have to be careful and stay out of harm's way. Like, oh, okay, yeah, cool, thanks, Doc. So then we're coming to the big reveal for Izuku's mom, finding out about One for All, the truth about the history and how it ties to everything, and further going into why Izuku has been so incognito this time. He says, Shigaraki can find my location at any time, and that is absolutely true. Let us not forget that Shigaraki has Ragdoll Search Quirk, which is actually pretty broken now that I think about it, because I think it allows him to know up to 100 different people's location at all times, but not only that, also their weaknesses too. But yeah, he knows Izuku's location at all times pretty much, so he's just a walking Dragon Ball in his internal Dragon Ball radar. So that's why he has to stay away from everybody, not draw too much attention to himself. And another reason he's explaining why he can't go back to UA here, because if he did, he's inviting death to his friends pretty much. And then Izuku says something else interesting here. He says if Shigaraki perfects his form sooner than later, this situation will go from bad to worse. I need to stop Shigaraki and All for One before that happens. So this has been teased for a while now. The 100% are just the full perfect form of Shigaraki plus Ultra Shigaraki. We only saw him at 75% of his true potential in the war, and then obviously we all know what happened after that. So does this mean that he's actually going to stop Shigaraki before achieving his full metamorphosis? It's possible, but man, that would be a little weird, right? Considering how much it was set up and foreshadowed and talked about. I mean, I don't want to say it's Chekhov's gun, but kind of like a Chekhov's gun thing, right? Like, we need to see Shigaraki at 100%. I just feel like it would be weird if that just doesn't happen. I mean, also, we need an excuse for Izuku to go 100% as well. I mean, I guess that's the ultimate battle here. both of them at the peak of their power, I don't see why not. All for One's kind of a wild card. He's obviously going to have some part in this, but just Shigaraki, we'll say for now. So then we get like this big emotional moment from his mom, and she's disapproving as expected, but he's like, look, I gotta do this, Mom. I'll just come back later, all right? Everything will be fine. So then All Might, I guess, begrudgingly agrees to this, and then we have the formation of the team here, like Best Jeanist, Hawks, Endeavor, All Might, and Izuku. And as per Best Jeanist, they're going to be using Izuku as bait to track Shigaraki down. So then we cut to Izuku visiting Gran Torino in his hospital bed, and he tells him about the Nana stuff because she said, hey, tell Gran Torino I said hi when they were in the Vestige world. And then Gran Torino says, don't be too stubborn about redeeming Shigaraki. Sometimes death can be a form of salvation too. So this is another instance of them talking about how Izuku might have to potentially straight up kill Shigaraki. This was a topic brought up between the Vestiges a couple chapters back as well. And it brought forth the options of like, hey, this might not be able to have like a happy ending where Izuku somehow saves Shigaraki through, I don't know, talk no jutsu, or he just somehow non-violently defeats him and reforms him in some way. But then it's also showing that there's a very real option here that you might have to just put Shigaraki down. He's, in my opinion, way past the point of saving at this point. I mean, yes, he was inherently innocent, but given everything that has happened throughout his life, and it's just too far at this point, and I think what Gran Torino is saying here is pretty accurate. Death will be a form of salvation for Shigaraki in this case. Then we see him give Izuku his scarf, hood, cape thing, and that confirms that what he's been wearing this whole time, it was in fact Gran Torino's. Then we come to the final panel of the chapter, and it says, time to repay the favor to the League of Villains. Top 3, Deku and All Might team up. So this was like a big cut to the future, I suppose. I mean, not like weeks or days, but just, hard cut to them seemingly going after the League of Villains immediately here. And it makes me think, is this like the beginning of the final arc? I mean, like I said, we're in the final act, but not necessarily in the final arc, meaning that we're in the final stretch of chapters until the series is over. I personally don't think we are, but maybe this is going to, I don't know, lead into the beginning of that or something, because if they are straight up going after the League of Villains here, that would mark the ending of it, right? But I don't know, there's just so many other character arcs that we need to go through, so many other story points, that I think this is just the beginning of the end, more so than I guess even chapter, is it 306 or 307 was? So this chapter starts off with us seeing a giganto-heteromorphic type citizen being attacked by other citizens with some kind of support gear that shoots like water or something. And it's entirely a misunderstanding because they think that this giant woman is a villain, but she's not. And Deku comes to save her, and he's like, it's a rainy night, tensions are high, but this person is not your enemy. And they're like, if she was innocent, she should stop acting so suspicious then. And she explains that she was just late for the evacuation and she was going to the shelter eventually, and that she was really scared. And Izuku's like, I'm sure everyone else is scared as well. And then she says, do you think things will go back to normal? And he says, they will. So I guess this opening sequence is really just establishing the state of society, at least in Japan right now. As Izuku said, tensions are high. We're coming off of the big war, a lot of hero deaths, a lot of hero resignations, the multiple prison breaks with tons of villains all out in the open now, running wild. So understandable that, things are the way that they are right now. And it's also interesting considering what the 5th user says to Izuku later on in this chapter about how it's like they kind of went back in time because society has regressed at this point. It certainly wasn't always the polished society that we, the readers, have come to know since, beginning the series, which is mainly because of All Might, I suppose. But before he really brought order to Japan, or maybe even just the whole world in general, it was a pretty crazy environment, not just for the villains and just people with crazy quirks running wild, but also because of vigilante profiling, because being a pro hero wasn't always a thing either. Then All Might shows up to help Izuku evacuate this large woman who was even bigger than All Might, so I guess she's like 12 feet tall or something. Then All Might gives Izuku some pork katsu for him to eat, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, but apparently Izuku's favorite food is pork cutlet bowls, so that's a little nice moment. But going back to when Izuku is talking to Banjo, the 5th user, they say we still don't have any clues on Shigaraki and All for One, and the League of Villains and everyone else, and they're basically in the dark. But Shigaraki with All for One's quirk would become so powerful that essentially no one, even like a dream dream team of like Endeavor, Aizawa, and the other top heroes working together wouldn't be able to stop him. So it's like it has to be Izuku with the full power of One For All in order to get the job done here. And it's that sends us all the way back to the end of chapter 305 when the first user is talking to the second and third user saying like, please you guys, work with us. He needs your power. If Izuku is going to unlock the full power of One For All, he's going to need your cooperation. So they're still standing facing the wall and there's like this silence after the first user says that. And then to break the silence, Banjo gets Izuku's attention and he's like, hey, you better get used to using the other quirks you hear, like the fourth and sixth user's quirks, Danger Sense and Smoke Screen. And then the sequence gets pretty interesting at this point because the second and third users finally begin to speak, but it's also kind of implied that Izuku can't hear them because we see the fourth, fifth, and sixth users like talking to Izuku at a distance, helping him with the quirk stuff. But it's also being made out that like, I guess he's not hearing what the second and third are saying, meaning that they're just exclusively talking to each other in the first. But the third user says, we came from the harshest era of history when All For One was at his peak and he was ready to dominate the entire world. Back then, those who were dominated couldn't even tell that they were dominated, and the leader was scared of that future. To prevent him from taking full control, it took us working together to push back against him. And that totally makes sense because, the second and the third existed at the same exact time. And that was also back when the first user was still alive, which was, implied to be like 100 or even over 100 years ago. And also, aside from just him talking, we're seeing the third user's face. And he looks like a new character, I guess. I don't think he's Kirishima. It seems like this is just like an original character at this point. Then finally, the second user speaks and he says, Yoichi would know, right? And then the first user responds saying, yup, meaning that the first user's name is Yoichi, which makes sense, given the whole naming thing of the vestiges. And we're seeing the second user's face, and he still kind of looks like Bakugo, but not exactly. Like, the hair is just mildly different. It's a different color as well. The eyebrows are different, but the eyes are the same. But the one glaring difference, of course, is that he has a huge scar across his face. So it's still up in the air on exactly what's going on with this guy and who he is, because we don't get a name drop or even like a quirk reveal or anything like that. But I'm going to make an entire video dedicated to all of the vestiges next week, where I'll go into some speculation about this guy. But we're getting more insight into why they are the way that they are, I guess. And he says, you think that we could really get behind some bright-eyed brat who wants to save his arch nemesis? And Yoichi says, I agree, it's certainly delusional, just like how a certain pair saved their nemesis and extended a helping hand back then. And while he's saying this, we see a flashback of the second and third users breaking into that room that All For One like locked Yoichi away in, that we saw in the original flashbacks of that sequence. And the second user like aims his gauntlet at Yoichi at first, and this is the clearest we're getting to see of what's going on with his gear. Now, this definitely doesn't look like Bakugo's gauntlet because, Bakugo still has his hands free, and this kind of like has a vertical barrel to it, which is just completely covering his hand. And I think this might be lining up with what I've been speculating about, with his quirk being some kind of like laser beam or some kind of projectile or energy blast or something like that. But clearly there's a reason why he needs the support gear to be able to use it. So that goes into what his ability could be as well. But it ultimately means that the last quirk that Izuku unlocks will likely be this. But then Yoichi says to the second user that if you didn't get me out of that room right then and there, nothing would have started. So in a way, that kind of strengthens the Bakugo time travel theory a little bit, because the whole purpose of him going back in time was to save Yoichi and to start the lineage of One For All. Not saying it's confirmed, of course, far from it, but I just think it's pretty interesting how it's kind of lining up with that theory, right? Then Yoichi says, isn't the reason you brought up the past that you realized that fact in the first place? And then the second user says, you really think the kid will save the day? And Yoichi's like, yup, One For All will never bow to my brother, but it's because you extended your hand that One For All was able to begin in the first place. So I guess this is the moment where Yoichi is like convincing the second that Deku is the one that we can put our faith into. Like, he is the one that is going to stop stop All for One finally. And while he is a bright-eyed kid who wants to save his arch nemesis, he's not too far off from you yourself. And then we come to the very end of the chapter where I think the second user is directly talking to Izuku here, at least like in vestige real-time form, the way that the sixth user was talking to Izuku a couple chapters back. And he says, "Listen clearly, kiddo. We're going full speed ahead now." And Izuku says, "Yes, sir," while he's like eating his pork cutlet. So I guess this is confirming that Izuku has unlocked his quirk along with the thirds at this point. Although it's possible that we could have seen him use the third user's quirk at the end of chapter 308. I mean, maybe, you know, with the whole line coming off of his back. I don't want to say that that's confirmed, but it's a possibility. And also in the spoilers yesterday, the translator said that the full speed ahead now thing could be like a pun on what the quirk could be, meaning that the third user does in fact have some kind of like engine type quirk, because we even see it more clearly in this chapter that he has some kind of mufflers coming off of him. So today I mainly just want to talk about the latter portion of this chapter because it's super exciting and there's a lot to go into and a lot of fun speculation to be had. And as for like, I guess 3/4 of this chapter, we're just following the top 3 heroes, Endeavor, Hawks, and Best Jeanist. Them going around stopping more of the Tartarus escapees, us seeing society regress more and still having a hard stance against Endeavor and I guess just heroes in general still. And them being caught up on the main plot line going on right now with All for One, Shigaraki, how they link up and how it all ultimately relates to Izuku and One for All. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on this stuff, you can check out my spoilers video from yesterday. I basically go over everything then, and it doesn't really seem like much has changed now that we're seeing the full chapter. But anyway, we're coming to All Might in his car and he's like tracking Izuku via GPS. And he says he's still moving around. Young man must not be getting much sleep. And then he has like a flashback to Night Eye saying like, please, for once, get some rest in a nice fluffy bed. So I guess this is important for 2 reasons. First of all Might is now having parallels to Izuku. When All Might was still the symbol of peace, I guess it's implied that he hardly ever slept because he was always conducting justice. And this is like the beginning of Izuku following in All Might's footsteps. And All Might now being on the outside looking in. And now he has the perspective that Night Eye has, and I guess is beginning to understand why it's not necessarily good to have your foot on the gas at all times. But I also think that Night Eye is being brought up here because of the death prophecy thing, which we'll get into, because after he remembers this, he notices that Izuku's GPS signal vanishes, and then like a grenade straight up goes inside of his car, and it's like right next to his face. And it explodes, and taking the car with it, it appears. So does this mean that All Might is dead? I honestly don't really know at this point. I mean, if we're just reading this for what it is on the page, then yeah, I guess he's straight up dead, because All Might in his true form, and I never really liked that moniker for it, but we'll say nerfed All Might, you know, the All Might that we know post season 3, there's no way that he'd be able to tank a grenade to the face, or at least I don't think he can. So taking nothing else into consideration, he should in theory be dead right now. But this is Horikoshi after all, and I really wouldn't be surprised if All Might somehow survives this. Now, how does he survive it? I don't know, it's anybody's guess right now. But at the same time, if he doesn't survive this and has this crazy unexpected death, I really wouldn't be mad at that because it's unexpected. And as I said before, with the death prophecy coming from Night Eye, there's been like this sort of Damocles hanging over All Might's head for a majority of the series at this point. So we knew that it was coming sooner or later, but we expected it to be like Shigaraki or, you know, at the minimum All for One, who was going to do him in. But if it's just this, you know, him, I guess, seemingly being killed by the woman that we're going to be talking about at the end of this chapter, then that's a pretty interesting surprise and a twist in a way. Because like I said, we did know that he was going to die, but we expected it to be like in this big ceremonious way, where we like essentially saw it coming. But if it just happens like this, when we least expected it, I guess, then hey, you know, hats off to Horikoshi for pulling it off. But even if he does survive this, then in theory, he would be living only to eventually just be killed by Shigaraki or All for One anyway, right? But I guess we'll just have to wait to see how he somehow either gets out of this or doesn't. Not really sure. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. So then we cut to Izuku, and he was like just on his phone, but then it like gets shot out of his hand. Then we see the thing that shot his phone, and it has like a speaker on it, and the person says, "Young boy in green, we'll take you with us. Follow my orders and I'll leave your limbs attached." And it's none other than the nameless woman from Tartarus. And we're seeing what I guess her quirk is, because she has like her elbow open and this like organic cyberpunky sniper rifle thing's coming out of it. And while this answers some questions, it creates a whole bunch of new ones too, because like, what exactly is this quirk? Because back in chapter 297, when she was breaking out of Tartarus, we see her spot Overhaul's cell, and we'll get to Overhaul. And when she like grabs the lock on the door, her hands like start glowing, or this stuff comes off of it. So I thought maybe that had something to do with her quirk. But now that she has like this elbow rifle thing, I don't know what's going on with her quirk. But the fact that this is such a specific thing makes me think that this has to be her quirk, or maybe her quirk is, I don't know, kind of like Overhaul's maybe in a way, where it's very versatile and she could do multiple things, where she like, I don't know, manipulates her body or something. And maybe that's why she like singled out Overhaul and released him from his cell, because she drew parallels to him or something. But anyway, let's go to Overhaul, because he's here. I did not know about this in the spoilers because he was not mentioned in them. It was only after the fact, when we got to fully see the leaked panel, that he is right there with her with his back against the wall, looking all sad and emo. So this is huge, because now we're going to have the reunion between Izuku and Overhaul. And I say that because I'm almost positive that Izuku is willingly going to go with this woman here. Maybe he'll fight back a little bit at the minimum, but it seems like he wants to go with her, because obviously his whole goal is to stop All For One and Shigaraki, and he was using himself as bait to lure them out at this point, so it makes sense that he would want to go with her. Especially since he fully assumes that she's being sent by All For One, since he says, "An assassin sent by All For One." Now, it's not 100% confirmed that she is in fact working with All For One, because when she did break out of Tartarus, we don't really know what happened after that. But I guess off panel, you know, they got together and, you know, she's working with him now or something, I don't know. But going back to Overhaul, I think this is confirming something that I talked about a couple chapters back, about how we got to see the future of Izuku's reunions, I guess, in chapter 305. Because when he's talking to Nana in the Vestige world, he says, "Up till now, I've come up against all types. They've refused to back down, so fighting was the only way to stop them. But I never understood what made them turn out that way. If I had, maybe things would have worked out differently." So while he's saying this, we see Muscular, Overhaul, Stain, and Gentle and La Brava. So obviously we just got over the whole Muscular thing a couple chapters back, and now we're coming to Overhaul. So I'm pretty sure that means that we're eventually gonna get to Stain and Gentle and La Brava as well. But as for Overhaul right now, I'm super curious to see how Izuku responds to him and vice versa. Considering that Overhaul is like super emo right now, maybe he'll have like a completely different mindset. I mean, I don't think he's going to turn face or anything. I expect him to still be, you know, pretty evil for the most part. But the fact that he's here is very exciting. And I also think he represents a more important aspect to the story, rather than just him and Izuku having like a heart-to-heart or something. And that's because his quirk is ultra broken. It's one of the best quirks ever. And once they go back to All For One, whoever, I fully expect All For One to take Overhaul's quirk from him and then use it to his benefit. Maybe that's how he, I don't know, somehow finishes plus Ultra Shigaraki and brings him up to 100% possibly. Why not? It seems like it would very likely be capable of doing that, right? So the chapter starts off with Hawks talking to Izuku in like a flashback, and he says All For One and Shigaraki have yet to reach the stage where they can steal One For All by force. Not only that, but without Dr. Garaki, they shouldn't have a way to preserve a dead body, so capturing you alive must be the villain's best bet, which for most Tartarus escapees would be impossible. But if that woman is involved, it's a different story. So that woman he's referring to here is the sniper from the end of the chapter, the female villain that we've all been intrigued by, who broke out of Tartarus. She's getting fully revealed and explained in this chapter. So it turns out her name is Lady Nagant, but not only that, but she was Hawks' former senpai back in the Public Safety Commission. She's actually referred to as a former public safety hero. So she was pretty much doing the same thing as Hawks Hawks, I guess. This is pretty interesting because I think besides Hawks, this is the only other public safety hero that we've been introduced to. Before this, the Public Safety Commission was just mainly like the higher-ups and the suits. We didn't really get to see any other heroes like Hawks. But going further, he says, however, if you find yourself engaged with her in a fight, please do everything you can to run away. So aside from her getting introduced in this chapter, she's very heavily hyped as well. I mean, they're really establishing her as like one of the top villains in this chapter, and it's understandable because she is pretty powerful, at least from what we've seen here. So in the previous chapter, she told Izuku not to move, but he does anyway, so then she fires at him again, but he's able to get away from it, and he's like swinging around the city like Spider-Man, and he says, my secret transmission device was destroyed. You know, he wanted to contact Hawks and All Might, but he can't do that now. And then he says there's a chance they'll target where I'm heading. For now, I'll just do as I was told and retreat. But as he's getting away, we see that she's sent a bullet at him that can like curve, kind of like from that movie Wanted. And it seems like at the last second, Izuku's able to grab the bullet to stop it from like completely piercing him. Then we randomly cut to like Snipe, a hero we haven't seen in a very long time, on like this TV show or something. And I guess this is like a memory that Izuku had watching this show as a kid or something maybe. And this is literally just Snipe delivering exposition on Lady Nagant, as well as hyping her up further, where he says like if it wasn't for her, he'd be the best long distance sniper in Japan, and that the range of her quirk is 3 kilometers, which is like almost 2 miles. And then he explains how her bullets work, saying that she mixes and molds her 2-color hair like epoxy putty before hardening it into a bullet. She can make anything from hollow points to bullets that also curve. And the name of her quirk is Rifle. So then we come back to like Izuku falling, and he says, if it wasn't for the 4th, I would have been defeated a long time ago, referring to the 4th's quirk, Danger Sense, which allowed him to, you know, stop the bullet at the last second. And then he says, but with that shot along with the first one, I figured out where she is, about 1 kilometer ahead. Her range is 3 kilometers. Rather than enduring this barrage while escaping from her range, I'll get closer. And then we see him charging at her, but a piece of like his gauntlet was broken from taking one of those bullets. The new gauntlets from America that he received a couple chapters back. And then Lady Nagant says this is the first time someone has deflected 2 of my bullets, so further hyping her up, but also giving Izuku some props too. Then we cut over to Overhaul, who is revealed to just be there randomly with her at the end of the previous chapter. And he starts talking, and he says, I want to go back to the old man now. And Lady Nagant's like, yeah, as soon as we're done here, go hide, the target is coming, and maybe I should have left you behind. Then we cut back to the Tartarus prison break from chapter 297, and we're seeing what we didn't get to see before, and it's Lady Nagant talking to All For One. Then All For One says, the traitor hero, the beautiful Lady Nagant, it's an honor to meet you. I consider you to be leagues above everyone else. Please, I have a favor to ask you. Soon enough, there will most likely be a boy who leaves UA and starts acting independently. I want you to capture him and bring him back to me. So yeah, All For One somehow knew that all of this was going to happen. I mean, it's not really surprising. I mean, he's like a genius. He's lived for, you know, over 100 years at this point. Then Lady Nagant is like hesitant to accept his offer, and he further says, you've slaughtered many of your fellow heroes. The fall of the pro-hero society that you wish for will never arrive as long as this boy lives. And then I guess that was enough to convince her to join All For One and do what he wants. Also giving us insight into, I guess, why Lady Nagant was in Tartarus in the first place and why she's referred to as the hero traitor. Because apparently she's slaughtered many of her fellow heroes, and her wish is seemingly the fall of pro-hero society. And that's pretty much all the information we're getting here. We don't know, you know, why she suddenly had this 180, or maybe she was always kind of like that. I'm assuming that she was probably like a really good, you know, morally just hero for the most part, and then one day she saw something or experienced something that made her like snap or something. I mean, there's a few manga villains that have that backstory to them. So then All For One sees Overhaul with her, and he says, the young boss of the 8 precepts of death, is he a friend of yours? She's like, no, he's a broken man, but I thought he could be useful later on. He is another victim of the evil pro-hero society. So I talked about this in the spoilers for this chapter, but like, does she know like what Overhaul has done? I mean, like, you know, like the really bad stuff. I'm assuming that she doesn't, or if she does, maybe she still wouldn't care. Not really sure. But if anybody is not a victim, it's definitely Overhaul. Then coming to the end of the chapter, we see All For One like about to put his hand on her head, and he says, to put an end to these darn heroes, come on now, let's make a deal. Consider this a security deposit. And then in the last panel, we see Lady Nagant like floating, and it says quirk, airwalk. So yeah, this means that All For One gave Lady Nagant his airwalk quirk. We saw him use this in the Camino arc, so understandable that he has this ability to give, but how is she able to receive another quirk here on top of the inherent rifle quirk that she already has? I'm honestly not really sure, because as far as I know, it's been established at this point that your brain can't handle having multiple quirks. That's why they had to augment the Nomus the way that they did. Now, there are some outliers to this, like, you know, with One For All's formation. Obviously, Yoichi inherently had that quirk that could pass itself on to others, and seemingly All For One didn't know that, so then he gave him the Power Stockpiler quirk, and then in that special circumstance, those two quirks fused together and made One For All. But I think this might be the second instance, outside of One For All being passed on to the other people who've had it, that someone else has just straight up received an extra quirk here from All For One, without them being like a Nomu or having some kind of augmentation to them. Now, either All For One did something special to allow this to happen, or maybe this was always the case, that he could always just give somebody an extra quirk or something, but maybe one is like the most, or maybe because she's so powerful, she can somehow handle having two quirks. Or this is ultimately going to be detrimental for her. Like, maybe she's on borrowed time here because she does have two quirks, and maybe her brain will eventually rot or something. Or it'll just be detrimental to her in some way. Because even the fourth user discovered that, like, him having One For All on top of his original quirk, Danger Sense, like aged him twice as fast or something. And I also think that Nomu's being brought up in the beginning of this chapter probably has something to do with what's going on here at the end, maybe. Like I said, not really sure, but I don't think it's just going to be, you know, fine for her with this. I mean, I do think there's going to be some kind of price to pay. I mean, think about it. Why didn't he just give the League of Villains all multiple quirks if this was just like such a normal thing, you know? So we got the reveal of Izuku's new quirk in this chapter, and it turns out that it's the third user of One For All's quirk. So that means the only quirk left to discover for Izuku to have is going to be the second user's quirk. But before I go into breaking down what the third user's quirk is, let me give you some context as to what's going on in this chapter and what essentially forces Izuku to use it. So Izuku's like darting around the city in this chapter, trying to outwit Lady Nagant, who is firing off on him from a distance because All For One gave her airwalk, so she's like hovering in the sky right now, trying to pick off Izuku with her rifle quirk. But she almost winds up getting the better of Izuku, and he eventually gets to the point of where he just plants himself and activates the 6 user's quirk smoke screen, but the full throttle variant of it, which I guess is just using its maximum power to where he's filling, like, it looks like multiple city blocks with smoke. And then the vestige of the 6th user comes out and says, releasing too much smoke is a pretty risky move. The enemy is a so-called flying artillery battery. She'll hit you as soon as you leave the smoke, so you've got nowhere left to run. And Izuku's like, I'm not going to run, I just need to buy some time. And then we see him like crouch down, and the 6th user's like, oh wait, that could be dangerous, I don't really recommend that. And then suddenly the 3rd user's vestige appears and says, I know what you're trying to do, but you have yet to reach that state. It's like you said yourself, first figure out how to handle 2 processes at once subconsciously. Once you've got that down, throw in another thing. This is in reference to chapter 248, back when Endeavor was training the big 3 of 1A. Izuku was talking to Endeavor about his move set, and eventually got to Izuku asking him about parallel processes, and Endeavor pretty much verbatim said this. And this is why the 3rd user is referencing that. But going going further, he says, you have yet to try my quirk. Before attempting parallel process, and then Izuku cuts him off and he says, I can't be too slow. If we want to stop Lady Nagant, All for One and Shigaraki will come next. I'll learn how to use your quirk right now. And then he's like fully engaged in his like crouching stance, and he seems to be like charging up, and he says third Fa Jin. So Fa Jin is probably what this quirk is called, and I say that because I'm not really sure what the official name is going to wind up being, because when we got the spoilers yesterday, it was being referred to as Hake. And I looked both of them up, and they seem to more or less mean the same thing, and I'll go into the definition of this word Fa Jin, but I just want to go over the other stuff first. So the third just said, you have yet to try my quirk, which I guess is straight up confirming that this is the first time we're seeing Izuku using it, meaning that he probably didn't use it against Muscular a couple chapters back. Now, after getting crouched in his position, getting ready to use the third's quirk, he starts throwing random things that he has out of the smoke screen, like Gran Torito's cape, his backpack, and his mask. And these are all like decoys for Lady Nagant to shoot at, because she could still only currently see the smoke screen. Then at the end of the chapter, out of nowhere, like a human rocket, Izuku shoots out of the building beneath Lady Nagant and immediately grabs her arm. And that's where the chapter ends. So that was pretty much Izuku using the third user's quirk here. So now let me go into what Fa Jin actually is. So it means to issue or discharge power explosively, or refining the explosive power, and is not specific to any particular striking method. The term usually refers to a set of methods to generate and focus force, resulting in physical feats with far less visual physical expression, such as the 1-inch punch. And as for Hake, it basically just means to release internal force. So like I said, the same thing as Fa Jin, more or less. So the way that I'm seeing this is that the third user's quirk allows Izuku to have like one super exaggerated movement, because like in this chapter it's depicted as Izuku like crouching down and then doing like this hyper fast like Hulk jump. And also how we just talked about, it's not limited to just like one movement or one strike. I'm assuming that he could do this with virtually anything, like jumping, maybe like a sprint, or possibly even like a strike. Like he can use this in junction with like a Delaware smash or like a Manchester smash or something, and make it that much more powerful, which I think is where things are headed. Like Izuku will eventually start pulling off like Saitama-esque punches. I mean, like just in theory, if he were to use Fa Jin with like a powerful smash attack. And also, if you've been following the channel, you know that I've been saying that the third user's quirk is probably like the thunderclap of My Hero, and it seems that that is certainly the case. Not just necessarily the thunderclap from like Demon Slayer, but that is usually always kind of like the same thing. Like stationary charge, then one instant attack. That's usually like the fastest thing, or one of the fastest things we've seen in that series. So in a way, this is like Izuku's thunderclap quirk. Now going back to the third user himself, I've talked about it many times, but he has like these support items on his shoulders that look like little mufflers, like similar to what Ida has. And I thought at first maybe that was like a heteromorphic trait of his, and that went into his quirk, just like Ida's family's engine quirk. But looking further into it, it appears that that's like support equipment, like it's a part of like the vest thing that he was wearing. So I guess that just aided him in his Fa Jin quirk here. Like maybe that helped him control it or go in a different direction or something. And it makes me wonder if we'll possibly see Izuku have this as well, because the second user also had support gear, or at least it seems that way, to assist in his quirk, which means that, you know, maybe Izuku will need the same thing once he starts using the second user's quirk. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the video today, guys. Let me know what you think about the third user's quirk. Do you like it? Do you think it makes Izuku too overpowered? I've seen that discussion come up a few times, and it's honestly like a necessary evil at this point. Like Izuku becoming that powerful, like he kind of needs to, because Shigaraki and All for One are pretty much that powerful. They're many leagues above the other characters in this series, and if Izuku has some chance of winning without just having like this insane Deus Ex happen at the end, he's going to need significant increments of power as time goes on. So there's a few things revealed in this chapter, and I want to go over as much as I can, but the first thing I want to talk about is the new, or seemingly new, ability that we're seeing from Izuku, and it's like a new variation of his Black Whip quirk called 1 Point Strike, where it appears that he's able to like shoot a condensed version of Black Whip, and he essentially is making a grappling hook out of it, I guess. But let me break it down further. So as Izuku is going against Lady Nagant in this chapter, he seemingly has figured out her timing, and that's when he decides to activate One Point Strike. And we see him like almost throwing like a fist with his left hand, but then the concentrated Black Whip comes out of it and shoots towards her. She's able to narrowly avoid it, but it hits the building behind her and seems to stick into it. And just like a grappling hook, it's pulling Izuku to where it's stuck in the wall. So yeah, I guess this is like an excuse for Izuku having even another quirk, even though it's not another quirk, but in a way, it's like him getting a grappling hook quirk, I guess. And I'm on board with it. I think it's pretty cool. I like when Izuku, or just mainly the characters in general in the series, like use their quirks in like a utility sense. I think that's just as interesting as using them for like, you know, straight offense or something, you know, just strictly in terms of like battling. And also it's possible that, I don't know, Horikoshi might be like winking at the audience with this, because I'm pretty sure Black Whip is going to be revealed in the next episode. Like, I think at the end of the next episode is when Black Whips makes like its first appearance in the anime. So this could be Horikoshi being like, hey, Black Whip in the manga, Black Whip in the anime. But also another thing that, you know, we're all probably thinking about, and that this is making him more like Spider-Man than he originally was. As a lot of us know, Spider-Man is, I think, Horikoshi's favorite superhero, or at least one of them. And we see a lot of influence on Spider-Man with Izuku, you know, like Danger Sense, Black Whips, etc. And I think a lot of us felt that like the foundation of Black Whips was essentially supposed to be like Spider-Man's web, you know, but also to just give Izuku a really good utility quirk. Because in my opinion, at least, I think Black Whip is one of the best quirks in the series. Like, honestly, I think it would be better if there was like another character that had this quirk and it just wasn't a part of Izuku's arsenal, because it's essentially just what Sero has, but just much, much better. And granted, it's being amplified by One for All, but you know, let's just take that off the table and just say Black Whip has that power inherently. Give it to another character, and I think that would make things more interesting. And of course, I'm not saying that it's bad that Izuku has it. I'm on board with everything here. I just really like Black Whip, and the more versatile it becomes, and just the more interesting ways that Horikoshi figures out ways for Izuku to use it. But anyway, as he's like grappling, hooking at Lady Nagant, she says to herself, even in air, he's doing well. To avoid any damage to his joints, he's completely concentrated on trying to predict and avoid my projectiles. That's how it is. I will increase his mental burden. And then she aims her rifle at Overhaul, who, let us not forget, is still there. He's just been silent, or just the story hasn't been focusing on him. And he's like standing, I guess, on the edge of the building that he was on, and he's like screaming at Lady Nagant saying, still not done yet? Hurry up, I want to go back to the boss. And then Izuku, who is, I guess, still in grappling hook retracting mode, like flying at Lady Nagant, notices Overhaul screaming on the rooftop, and is like, Chisaki. So yeah, Izuku has finally spotted Overhaul here, and it appears that Lady Nagant is going to try to test Izuku's altruism by, I guess, forcing him to, instead going after her, for him to save him instead, giving her the upper hand. But at the minimum, it's just distracting Izuku, because she's saying, I will increase his mental burden. So either way, this is just a really good card played by Lady Nagant. But back to Overhaul and Izuku. What is going to happen in this sequence here? Well, it's really anybody's guess, but it's super exciting. So I'm assuming that Izuku and Overhaul are somehow going to make it out of this sequence alive. Not really sure about Lady Nagant. I certainly hope she doesn't die, because she's certainly a fresh breath of air within the villain landscape of the series. But I just feel that especially Izuku and Overhaul are going to make it out of this. And I mainly think that because it was revealed who Izuku is going to have future Talk no Jutsus with. Or at least I'm pretty sure it was revealed. I think it was like chapter 305 when Izuku is in the Vestige World talking to the Vestiges and everything. When he's talking to Nana's Vestige, he says, up until now, I've come up against all types. They refused to back down, so fighting was the only way to stop them. But I never understood what made them turn out that way. If I had, maybe things would have worked out differently. Or who knows, maybe I still would have had to fight them anyway. And as he's saying this, we see Overhaul, Muscular, Stain, Gentle, and La Brava. So we already had his encounter with Muscular a couple chapters back. And it turns out the latter portion of that statement applied to Muscular, because despite Izuku understanding understanding, for the most part, what made him turn out that way, things didn't work out differently, and he still had to fight him anyway. That's when we got the awesome, like Izuku Thunderclap sequence. But now that we're coming to Overhaul here, I'm assuming that maybe things will turn out differently this time once he has his conversation with him. Because Overhaul is certainly not himself right now. He's kind of like in this weird manic state where he's just so preoccupied with going to see his old Yakuza boss. So it's possible that Izuku might use that to his advantage and, I don't know, somehow works out, a successful talk no jutsu against Overhaul. I don't think Overhaul is going to have some kind of massive redemption or something, and I don't think he's going to be free or anything like that. He's either going to go back to jail or die, or both. But he might have somewhat of a subtle redemption, or as much of a redemption that you could justifiably give to a character of this level. And also, I fully expect Overhaul to live. So aside from the chapter 305 stuff, I think there's another reason why he's probably going to live, and that's because, his quirk is super important. The Overhaul quirk itself, one of the best quirks ever, and it would really be a waste if it was just thrown away, you know what I mean? I mean, there's a reason why he was left around up until this point, right? I'd like to think that Horikoshi had more story building in mind when he decided to have Shigaraki decay his hands off rather than just completely taking him out. And I do think that regardless of where that went narratively, it was probably a better fate for Overhaul than him just simply dying at that point. But the fact that he is still alive, still has his quirk, but he's pretty much just unable to use it at this point, I think has importance to it, and it will lead to All For One or Shigaraki taking the Overhaul quirk from him. Because I think that the Overhaul quirk will probably help them in achieving their ultimate ends. Maybe that allows him to finish Plus Ultra Shigaraki or something without the aid of Yujiko, who I think is still in jail, or just somewhere where the villains can't get him or something. Or maybe the Overhaul quirk could even help All For One himself. Maybe it could unpotato-fy him or something. I mean, in theory, I guess it could, right? But even if All For One does do that and fixes his body, it doesn't ultimately solve his main problem, which is his software not keeping up with the hardware, which is the whole purpose of Plus Ultra Shigaraki in the first place. So he still will need to transfer vessel, but in the meantime, he might fix the vessel that he has, So in this chapter, we're getting a full explanation on exactly what Izuku's new quirk Fa-Jin is. Before, we could only really go off of visual clues and what its name was, because that's all we really had at the time. But before I break it down, let me explain the sequence. So at the end of the previous chapter, Lady Nagant decided to shoot at Overhaul as a way to distract Izuku, who at that point used his new technique, pinpoint focus, to launch himself at her, using Black Whip as a grappling hook slingshot kind of thing. But once Nagant shot at Overhaul, Izuku decided to change his trajectory using Black Whip once again, but at the same time, this is creating crazy centrifugal force, and we'll get into that because it's playing into Izuku's new moveset here. But now he's swinging around to come and save Overhaul, and that's where we're getting the explanation of what Fa-Jin exactly is. So apparently, by repeating regular motions, he can store and release kinetic energy. That's it. That's straight up the definition of Izuku's Fa-Jin quirk. And in this sequence, apparently he's building up the kinetic energy in his legs, which will later allow him to do a pretty epic move. But continuing this exact sequence here, he says, while she's shooting at me, I'm going to try to bend and stretch my legs in order to protect my body. Then he says, one for all, 45%, plus centrifugal force. What we were just talking about, how he's using Black Whip to swing around the building and alter his trajectory towards Overhaul. Everybody from our generation knows about this move. I'll mimic All Might's form and become faster than her bullets. And we see him mid-flight go out into a T pose. I suppose this is to assert his dominance over the bullet and Overhaul. And before the bullet hits Overhaul, he makes it there and knocks him out of the way, saving him. And he calls this pseudo 100%. And I'm assuming he's calling this it because it's not him literally using 100% of one for all, but he can kind of replicate a force similar to that by using 45% of one for all along with Fa-Jin, along with the centrifugal physical force created in this whole movement. So it's kind of like he's performing an action that would require 100% of One For All, but instead, by combining all of these abilities, he's replicating a force similar to that without having to put the tax on his body from actually using literally 100% of One For All. Now, also, when he says he's mimicking like All Might's form in order to do like the T-pose thing, the only time I remember All Might doing something like in this type of pose is when he does like the Carolina Smash. But anyway, after he knocks Overhaul out of the way, saving him from the bullet, he says, "We aren't done yet, Chisaki." So this is pretty cool, aside from just Izuku being like dominant in this sequence. It's also reminding us that he is in fact going to have a conversation with Overhaul. And as I've also said before, this was kind of set up in chapter 305. Like when Izuku was talking to Nana in the Vestige world, it was basically establishing that like he was going to have a future conversation with his past opponents. It showed like Muscular, Overhaul, Stain, and Gentle and Labrava, and we already touched on Muscular. We're coming to Overhaul here, so that means that hopefully we are going to have Izuku's reunion with Stain, and then eventually Gentle and Labrava. Not really too concerned with them, mainly just want Stain here. He's one of my favorite characters, and the story desperately needs him in my opinion. But anyway, then he like shoots 2 black whips down at the building, kind of like how Spider-Man would do with his webs. And then the third's Vestige comes out and starts talking to Izuku, and he says before now he was switching between One For All 45%, Danger Scent, Smokescreen, Black Whip, Fajin, and Float, using them all in rapid succession, and as a result, his processing couldn't keep up and his movements halted. Having realized this from his previous attack, he's now restricting himself to only One For All Black Whip Fajin. And he's still got another leg's worth of Fajin. And I like this sequence because it's pulling Izuku back just a little bit, which I think is very necessary. We're all aware right now that he is incredibly powerful, almost too powerful. And that's actually the reason why a lot of people have gripes with the current arc of the series. But him using all of his quirks at once should have a drawback to him in some way. Especially now that we're moving past the whole drawback of his body not being able to use like at a certain amount of One For All, since it was established that his body is now acclimated to it, and now 45 is the new like 10%. He needs to have more restrictions to him, so him not being able to use all of the quirks at once is fitting and necessary. And also we need to, build up to that. He will eventually get to the point of where he is essentially the god of the My Hero world, but that time is not right now. But also the other thing mentioned about he's still got another leg's worth of Fajin, that just makes the quirk all that much more powerful, because apparently from this, he doesn't have to immediately use Fajin once he's activated it. And even if that was the rule of the quirk, it would still be fantastic, but the fact that he can like activate Fajin, store it, and then like hold it in the chamber until he wants to use it, like I said, just makes it that much more powerful. But he does go on to use the Fajin in the chamber and does a pseudo 100% Manchester Smash to Nagant here, completely wrecking her sniper rifle arm. And this is pseudo 100% for the same reason his previous, I guess we'll call it Carolina Smash maybe was. He has Fajin loaded up in his leg, but he's using a 45% Manchester Smash on top of that, so when you fuse them two together, it's creating a force which is similar to 100% without actually using 100%. So a combination of like Izuku saving Overhaul and overcoming Lady Nagant has like compelled her to have like a face turn. And if that wasn't enough, Izuku grabs Nagant as she's falling and he's like, "You've seen the dark side, so you should know exactly where to shine the brightest light. Fight alongside us. You still have the heart of a hero." And she's about to call Izuku a true hero, but then suddenly she explodes because All For One can somehow do this? Most of us are aware by now, but All For One is truly playing like 4D or 5D chess. I know it's a meme with a lot of these manga series we play, but All For One apparently always knows what's going on and knows what's going to happen. So he knew that Nagant was vulnerable to a face turn, so his contingency here was some kind of remote explosion or something. Not really sure how he's able to do this, but it's not like all of All For One's abilities and quirks are explained anyway. And as she's falling, we see her like all burnt up, and Hawks comes out of nowhere and grabs her. And he's like, "Don't die on me, senpai. high. We found out before that they have some kind of history in the Public Safety Commission. And also it's revealing that Hawks has his feathers and his wings are coming back, so that's pretty cool. Now, is Nagant dead? I'm not really sure because she didn't like explode, like her body is still in one tack, she's just burnt. The fact that Hawks is coming out of nowhere and is saying don't die on me, she straight up might live, or might live long enough to have like a tearful goodbye to Hawks, and maybe that further gives Hawks motivation to continue in this arc. Not really sure, but I would prefer it if Nagant lives and, you know, goes over to the hero side. I think that would be pretty interesting. So picking up from the end of the previous chapter, Hawks has come in to try to save Lady Nagant from falling after All For One blew her up because she turned face. Turns out Endeavor is also showing up as well, and this is because after All Might survived his false death, he was able to contact them. Then we go into this little sequence where like Hawks isn't able to fly yet, but it's still showing us that his quirk is coming back and that he will, you know, eventually get to his old self. And Izuku uses Black Whip to grab him in the nick of time and saves him and Lady Nagant from, you know, splattering. But then Izuku says Nagant was granted a quirk by All For One, which was Airwalk. It probably came with some sort of trap built into it. So I guess that's the explanation on how All For One was able to remotely blow her up. Not gonna go any more into it and try to figure out how it works because it honestly doesn't even seem like Horikoshi cares himself about this. But anyway, while they're being lowered to the ground, Hawks is talking to Lady Nagant. He's like, please tell me what you know. You can't die after being manipulated. You are a hero. You're Lady Nagant. And then she straight up tells him what he wants to know. She says, in the next 2 months, the target shall be brought to a mansion in Hybori Forest. So Lady Nagant is alive somehow. Another false death. I'm not really mad at it because I think Lady Nagant's a pretty cool character, and it seems like, you know, since she's turned face now, she's going to become a hero again. And also she's a powerful female character, so the more the merrier. Not really sure how the logistics are going to work with her recovery and her being reintegrated into like pro-hero society or even the Public Safety Commission. I mean, she was in Tartarus for a legitimate reason. She straight up killed the president at the time of the Public Safety Commission. Granted, it was self-defense, but I guess it still doesn't even matter. I don't know. I'm sure they're gonna bring this up again eventually, and then she'll get like a pardon or something. It just seems like she's probably going to be helping them, you know, eventually. But anyway, that brings us to what I think is probably the most interesting part of this chapter besides like the very last panel. And Lady Nagant says there's a few people who were called on besides me. And then we see this silhouette of All For One with like 5 or 6 villain silhouettes behind him. But this has me pretty excited because this is what I wanted. I wanted like a League of Villains B team, which I guess this essentially is. And I'm also assuming that this is like the best of Tartarus, like that All For One was able to scrounge together. But that begs the question of like, can we figure out who is exactly in this panel here? Maybe there's 1 or 2 characters that, you know, we might be able to decipher here. One of them, I'll just say, is probably Moonfish because he was shown to be in the Tartarus prison break and we haven't seen him since then. So I'm assuming that All For One was like, hey, join the B team. And also there appears to be like a short person or like an animal thing. I don't know. There's like something in the bottom right corner there. That could be something, or maybe it's not. I don't know. But as for the main piece of speculation here, you want to look to the left and you'll see the silhouette that appears to have like dreads or something. I'm sure I'm not the only one who thought this, but this guy looks very similar to Chimera from the Heroes Rising movie. This guy was a part of Nine's faction, and he was really powerful. Actually so powerful that I kind of had problems with it when I first watched that movie. Like his quirk is, I guess what his name is, Chimera. Like he has aspects of multiple animals, but he also has like super strength. Like he did like a Detroit Smash foot stomp. He's super tanky. And then he also can, for some reason, shoot fire from his mouth, but not only that, he can like shoot like a beam cannon from his mouth too. Like this guy's truly one of the most absurd villains that I've ever seen in this series. Like he pretty much has like 5 or 6 quirks in one. And I thought that, wow, this guy, you know, he could have been used in the main series. Like he didn't have to be regulated to the movie. There was a lot of potential for him. So I think that would be awesome if Horikoshi decided to bring Chimera Chimera into the main continuity of the story here and had him be one of All For One's like top lackeys. And like I said, I'm just speculating. It's not confirmed or even close to being confirmed. It probably isn't even this guy. It's just some guy that has a silhouette similar to his, but I just think that would be cool if it was Chimera. But anyway, Endeavor's like wrapping everything up and he has Overhaul. And Overhaul is still, of course, complaining about having to see the boss and he wants to apologize to him and that wasn't the deal that he made and it's just the same thing we've been hearing for like the last 5 chapters. And Izuku starts talking to Overhaul. He's like, Chisaki. Then Overhaul's like, shut up, you sick little... I need that woman too. And then Izuku's like, do you remember what you did to Eri? And then Overhaul says, Eri, yeah, if only she were here. And Izuku says, seems like you've got someone you wish to apologize to. If only you could feel the same way towards Eri. The promise you made with Lady Nagant, I'll keep it. So I'm sure like 90% of us are like, no, Izuku, don't give this guy what he wants. Just throw him back in the slammer. But also we know that this is who Izuku is. He's like one step below being like full-blown Tanjiro from Demon Slayer. But it's clearly showing that Overhaul is not remorseful for what he has done, so I'm not really sure where his story is headed at this point with Izuku potentially bringing him to the Yakuza guy. I still fully expect All For One or Shigaraki to take his quirk. I think that's his ultimate destiny. But what happens before that? Not really sure. I don't really care. Overhaul kind of sucks now. But then Overhaul's like, Lady Nagant and Chisaki, I've secured them. Let the police know. I'll bring them to an emergency hospital. Midoriya, you're also hurt pretty bad. You should go with them. And then we get like these 2 black panels and one of them says All For One. And when we see like Hawks, Genist, and Endeavor and they're like, take care everyone, be careful. And Endeavor's like, Deku, wait, don't be reckless. Then there's like this aggressive time skip with Izuku in front of the mansion mentioned by Lady Nagant. But he's also with Best Jeanist, Mount Lady, Endeavor, Kamui Woods, and Edgeshot. Also, the mansion that they're going to is apparently the Creature Rejection Clan's hideout. We saw this place back in chapter 220 at like the beginning of the Villain Academia arc. The Creature Rejection Clan is pretty much based on who you think it is, but in this world, they like hate heteromorphic type quirk users. But considering that the Villain Academia is about to start in the anime, I really wouldn't be surprised if Horikoshi just shoehorned this in there so that it links up with that. But anyway, Izuku busts into the mansion and no one's there, which they say they expected. And then like this projection of All For One appears and it turns out All For One expected this. He knew that Lady Nagant was going to turn face and spill the beans to Izuku, so that's why he set up this whole elaborate contingency. Then he goes on this long villain diatribe, but it basically boils down to All For One saying, in prison I never stopped thinking about you. Take that for what you will. My interests are no longer in All Might. You're next. You know, kind of like poking fun at All Might doing the You're Next thing at Kamino. And then the mansion explodes. So what does this mean? I don't know. I mean, like I've been talking about, there's been so many false deaths lately that like I can't really be emotionally invested in this. But also maybe that means that this is the point where somebody dies because I'm not expecting it to happen. Not really sure, but if somebody does die, I guess it'll probably be Mount Lady, Kamui Woods, or Edgeshot, or maybe they get injured or something. Also, Deku has like danger sense, so maybe he could do something to save them in like a split second maybe. So picking up from the end of the previous chapter, it's nonchalantly revealed that the hero team here had survived that mansion explosion, and it just adds to the streak of false deaths that we've been having in the last like 7 chapters or something. And I've expressed my criticisms about this plenty of times, so I'll just say, you know, maybe pull it back a little, but also at the same time, I understand that this could be Horikoshi setting up a false sense of security, meaning that like the next false death won't be false. And I'll get into that because I think we see something in this chapter being set up that might be pretty significant. But anyway, the hero team is talking inside of like this warehouse or something, and they're discussing, you know, everything that's going on right now. But then Hawks gets a text from All Might and it says that they made contact with a second assassin, but Izuku took him out like instantly. And once we cut over to Izuku, we see him have like this dark, brooding kind of aesthetic to him. I mean, he's progressively become more and more disheveled and more, I'll say, stain-like since he's been reintroduced in like, I think it was chapter chapter 306. But this chapter is certainly showing him to be the most menacing that he's been so far. So after Izuku takes this guy out, he just darts away, on to the next one. And All Might's continuing to be like a close parental figure to him, saying like, be careful. And, hey, wait, you haven't eaten at all. And he gives him like another bento. And Izuku straight up just like, you don't have to follow me around anymore. I'm fine on my own now. And as he's saying this, he's remembering like two things. All for One in the previous chapter, like pointing at him saying that like, you're next. And he's also remembering the conversation that he had with All Might where he found out that he was basically destined to die, at least according to Night Eye's vision. And then we see the classic dialogue from that scene where it says, if you keep going like this, you will head towards a gruesome demise, one so terrible that it cannot even be put into words. So that's important because I think it's also going to lead into what I was talking about before with false deaths, maybe not being so false anymore. And then going further, Izuku's like, I could do it already. I could move at 100% without sustaining any damage just like you could. Now that's a pretty bold statement, and I don't know if that is 100% factual or if it's Izuku kind of just saying that to make All Might maybe feel better about him not monitoring him, because Izuku was kind of just at like 45% not too long ago, right? 45 along with Fa Jin, which makes the pseudo 100%. So is he talking about pseudo 100% here, or is he literally talking about just using like 100%, how we've seen him use throughout the series, like when he damages himself? I figured that maybe him going through that plateau would have had more significance on it, or just more attention brought to it, maybe like a chapter where he discovers it, or maybe like a stretch of chapters where he's like training it and then finally perfects it. But no, just off panel, he's developed the ability to just use 100% without taking damage anymore. Not really sure, but I guess time will tell. But then Izuku's like, don't worry about me, and he jets off, and All Might's like, I swore to protect you, but I know the weight of the responsibility you're carrying. I should have said, don't push yourself too hard. It's okay to take a break. And then like All Might falls over. But then we're getting the huge twist of this chapter because it appears that behind the wall or wherever they are right now, Stain is there, and he was listening to Izuku talking to All Might. And he has like a different costume in this chapter. He's actually pretty drippy. But this has me super excited because first of all, Stain is back, but also now it seems like he's going to finally meet All Might, but also it's like clearly showing us that All Might is alone right now and Stain is there. So I don't think Stain is just gonna walk away. I think he's gonna come from behind the wall and be like, hey, All Might. And then I'm just so excited to see what they have to talk about. But it seems like this might lead to All Might's death. Like, I think Stain might be the one who kills All Might. Because what I was talking about with like all of the false deaths and the false sense of security, but also the fact that the prophecy was brought up again in this chapter, the gruesome death can't be put into words. And now that they are seemingly alone, I guess this is gonna be it, right? Now, why would Stain kill All Might? Not really sure, because Stain was kind of like in love with All Might, and if anything, he wanted All Might to kill him. But also at that time, All Might's true form, or his, skinny form, wasn't known to the public yet, so there was no way that Stain could have known what was going on with All Might. And as far as I know, this is the first time that Stain is aware that All Might is, what he is. So it's possible that Stain might not see All Might as like the All Might that he used to see anymore, and maybe he thinks that killing him is like a good idea or something. Stain is insane, so he'll have some kind of weird rationale to his decisions. But it just really seems like this might be the end of All Might at the hands of Stain, which is certainly a twist. I guess we all assumed it would have been Shigaraki or All for One at this point. And another thing that may make this darker and sadder than it already is like we're having the falling out between All Might and Izuku. It's possible that like All Might dies and Izuku never has like a chance to say sorry or patch up their relationship because like he left him here and seemingly he's going to die. And I didn't talk about it in my spoilers video yesterday because I realized it after the fact, but it's possible that Izuku doesn't realize All Might is dead until he sees him in the vestige world, because that's something I forgot, that there's like a portion of All Might's soul in the vestige world. And it's possible that like once Izuku goes back there, he sees like fully vestige All Might and he's like, oh no, you're dead. And then that's like a huge sad moment. And maybe that snaps Izuku out of like the subtle, dark, manic state that he's in right now, or it sends him deeper into it. But let's get into that because we're coming to the end of the chapter, or I guess we're hearing like random people talking about Izuku, saying that like they say he appears without making a sound. I heard he has multiple quirks. Isn't that all for one's ability? Is he a gnome or something? But apparently he's here to help. I've heard he's covered in scars, blood, and mud. He doesn't look anything like a hero, and we see Izuku and he looks like a straight up monster here. This is the most menacing he's ever been, and he looks even more reminiscent to Stain now than he did originally. That's something that I guess a lot of us caught onto at first, like back in chapter 306 when we saw the new Izuku. It was like, oh, he kind of looks like Stain. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Stain is also showing up in this chapter, you know, probably showing us there are parallels between these two characters. Obviously, Izuku isn't insane the way that Stain is, but the similarities are obviously there. Now, does this mean that Izuku is like evil? No, not really. He's just kind of become like no nonsense, I guess, at this point. And he's not like the gleeful, you know, chipper Izuku that we've known just a couple chapters ago. It's just all for one, the lack of sleep, the constant stress. It's all, you know, getting to Izuku and making him change into what he is now. Although I guess he's always kind of been this person. He's just needed the outlet to advance to this. So we're seeing Izuku approaching his breaking point in this chapter, I guess. And I also think we're coming to like the absolute closest of him becoming an anti-hero. And I say closest because I don't think he'll ever become like a full-blown anti-hero. But what we've been seeing in this arc is what I think Horikoshi's like attempt is at something like that, maybe. Like the core of Izuku as a character will never, you know, like fully go in that direction, but at least he can have like the aesthetic of it, because that's another thing, is that we're seeing Izuku have like a full-blown like villain aesthetic, and I'll get into that. But instead of him like performing morally questionable actions, it's just that he's obsessed and he's like burning the candle at both ends. And also like at first people are afraid of him, so that adds to it, I guess. But that goes back to the villain aesthetic that I was talking about, because it's on display in a pretty cool way in this chapter. And we saw the start of it in the previous chapter, but it was really put on spotlight in the final panel of the previous chapter when we saw like Izuku in his dark villain-esque form, which is basically just an unintentional result of like the lifestyle that he's been living. But that combined with like how far he's come like power and ability wise, especially with Black Whip, those two things together give him like this very, you know, villain-esque monstrous appearance, because like Black Whip is now like coming out of him. Like he no longer really has to like shoot it from his hands or something. He's almost like Doc Ock with it at this point, which like I said shows how far he's come and how powerful he is right now. That along with his current villain aesthetic really just adds to it and makes people just fear him straight up when they first see him. But going back to burning the candle at both ends, that's pretty much the theme of this chapter. Like Izuku is approaching a breaking point. He's living this unattainable lifestyle where he's just constantly on the go. The way that it's been portrayed for the last couple chapters, that he's kind of been living like danger sense to danger sense. Like it'll trigger, then he'll go off and deal with whatever the issue was, and then he'll just wait for the next one and he'll keep doing that. I'm not even really sure if he's even been sleeping or anything during this whole entire time, or at least it's implied that he's been getting little, if any. And we're seeing everyone around him is like really worried about him. Like even Endeavor in this chapter is worried about him. We saw previously that All Might was, of course, the most worried about him. And the way that Izuku has become obsessed has led to like a minor falling out between them, to where he just straight up left. You know, all at that point it was revealed that Stain was like behind the wall near him, which is unfortunately not touched on in this chapter. I was really excited to see what was going to happen with that, but no, Horikoshi hit us with the swerve, and we're just going to have to wait to see what happened. But anyway, the Vestiges are also worried about him, and we see them like talking amongst themselves, and it seems like most of them are on the same page with wanting him to like pretty much take a break, stop not being so obsessed about everything, except for one of them, and that is the second user. And he says he shouldn't be allowed to stop, especially in a situation like this. That's what it means to wield one for all and carry on our wills. but perhaps. And then it cuts off there, and we don't find out what he says until the very end. But I think it's understandable why this guy feels this way, because what we know of him, or at least what's been shown so far, is that he came from like a hardcore time, therefore he is kind of like a hardcore byproduct of it. And he was also like the leader of the resistance against All For One, I guess, so he also had that whole thing going on. But obviously there's still a huge mystery to this guy. We, hardly know anything about him really, but I also think it's interesting that he's so like gung-ho about One For All. Like, this guy was the one who discovered Yoriichi, and if it wasn't for him, One For All wouldn't have been able to make it this far, obviously. But we're going to be talking about this guy in a little bit, because like I said, it's revealed what he says at the ending, and then that connects to a whole other can of worms. So we're cutting to Izuku going to like another Danger Sense location, and we're seeing like his internal monologue of him like obsessing about going after One For All and trying to save everyone, and he just wants to go back to normal, and he just wants to smile with everyone again. But the thing that I like most in this sequence is that it shows All Might and All For One both pointing at him saying, "You're next," which is just a great way to show how much pressure is actually on Izuku. It's like God and the devil saying like, "Hey, you're next up." But towards the end of this chapter, Izuku winds up running into one of the Tartarus escapees by the name of Dictator, who is also working with All For One. He also points out that All For One also predicted that Izuku is going to become obsessed and everything, so mark another one on the board for things that All For One knew was going to happen ahead of time. That whole aspect of him has really been like hammered home like after the war. But this Dictator guy seems to have like a quirk that's like a fusion between trumpets and shinsos, to where like trumpet can affect multiple people at once, but it seems like the Dictator has like these strings, it looks like, that they're connected to people maybe. So maybe he kind of like has like a Daffy type thing on, if you're familiar with One Piece and his parasecto or whatever parasite string thing he was doing. But he's controlling like a whole bunch of civilians. But unlike Shinso's quirk, they don't like become zombies. They're still fully conscious, but I guess he just has control over like their physical actions. So under the control of Dictator, they all go after Izuku and start like fighting him, but of course he can't fight back, and now he's kind of stuck in this situation until suddenly Bakugo shows up. Yes, Bakugo is finally back. Very excited to see him. And he hits the Dictator in the head with an AP shot, and then he says, "I found him, guys." So that implies that Class 1A has in fact been looking for Izuku, and it totally makes sense because he gave all of them that goodbye letter at the beginning of the arc. And since we know these characters well at this point, they're obviously not just gonna sit back and not go look for him. Especially Bakugo of all people. But that brings us to what the second user was saying earlier, and it turns out that he said, if there is something that we could do to protect Izuku Midoriya, and that connects with Bakugo in the final panel saying, "I found him, guys." So that's really interesting, right? That the second user is specifically pointing out Bakugo here, or at least it's implied that he is, and that's because of the whole big time travel theory that's been going on for a couple years that theorizes that the second user is in fact Bakugo, who goes back in time so that One For All can be passed on. But most likely, for now, I'll say, the second user is probably saying this because the Vestiges occasionally vicariously live through Izuku, so they're aware of his surroundings and who he has relationships with, and they also even feel his feelings. So he could just be picking Bakugo because he knows, based on that information, that he's the best person to be with Izuku right now to continue on with his mission. Or, if you want to get a little, spicy, you could say it's because he is Bakugo and there's no one better to be with Izuku right now than the former version of me. So the chapter opens up with a flashback to a few days after Izuku had initially left UA, like back in the chapter 306, 307 area. And Shoto and Bakugo are basically figuring out that Izuku is probably going to be with the top 3 heroes. And Ida's like, why don't you guys just contact your mentors? Because, we happen to have 3 students who are linked to the top 3 heroes. And they're like, we tried multiple times, but they didn't respond. We actually saw this a couple chapters back with like Endeavor straight up ignoring like Shoto's text. And that's funny because it's kind of come full circle, because originally it was Shoto who was ignoring Endeavor's text. And then they're like, well, they must be hiding something from us then. But then Jiro says something pretty interesting when she's like, from what I remember, All Might hasn't come back either, right? So the last time I think we saw All Might was when Izuku was having like that falling out with him, when he was like, you don't need to follow me anymore. anymore. I don't really need you. In fact, I'm actually able to move just as well as you did with One for All, so see ya. And he just pieced out of there and like left All Might like literally on his knees. But it was also revealed that Stain was there the whole time. He was like chilling behind this wall. But unfortunately, that sequence ended there and we don't know what happened. But considering what Jiro said, All Might hasn't returned, and that's not good. Because back when all that stuff was revealed, we thought, oh man, is this when All Might dies? Is Stain gonna kill All Might? And nothing happened from it. At the minimum, I thought they were gonna like talk or something, but now it seems, pretty sinister. I'm just so excited to see what's going to happen with that storyline. But it's also being revealed here that classes has been suspended and that their graduation has also been delayed, and that the Hero Course students have been placed on standby and asked to help secure the perimeter. So before this, we didn't really know what was going on with the academia side of things. Technically, they should be second years right now, and we the fans were pretty excited about that. But then the war happened, and it kind of just threw a wrench into all that stuff, and apparently their graduation has been delayed. And I guess the same goes for like the second, third years too. But then Bakugo figures out that All Might is probably tied to this whole operation as well, because if Izuku was so worried about going to UA, because of the possibility that All for One or the League of Villains or whoever might track him there, then why would he take the risk of going there to drop off the letters to let Class 1A find out about everything that's going on? One for All for One, how Izuku ties to it, why he can't come back anymore. So he figures, it had to be All Might that dropped off those letters. Then Kaminari is basically like, maybe we shouldn't really be too worried about Izuku, because if he is in fact with the top 3 heroes, then I guess he's okay. But then Bakugo's like, when it comes to Deku or All Might, I know them better than anyone. And this is the worst possible scenario you could think of. And then they're like, well, I guess we just need to figure out a way to contact them. And then Uraraka steps in, who I'm really liking in this chapter, and she's like, Endeavor is a UA alumni, right? Well then, let's be a little pushy. And then it cuts to a few days later and we see Nezu summoning Endeavor at UA, but also tricking him into having an audience with Class 1A. And then Shoto's finally able to confront him and he's like, why are you ignoring? Didn't you say that we would stop Toya together? And Endeavor's like, that sentiment alone was what saved me back then, back when they were in the hospital after the war. And then Shoto's like, I don't feel saved at all. Is Izuku an exception here? You're letting Deku and All Might act together, aren't you? And then Bakugo steps in. He's like, calm down a little bit, Shoto. Like, yeah, you probably made the right call. Well, at least it's close to the right call. You don't understand anything about Deku. That nerd is insane. He doesn't take himself into account. He always just insists he's fine. It's the same way All Might became the symbol of peace. We can't stop him. We can't just let them be. So then Endeavor pulls out his phone and Sero's like, isn't that the one with GPS? And then Endeavor like throws the phone to the students and they grab it. The implication here is that they're going to use that to track where Izuku's phone is, therefore finding Izuku's location. And then Ida's like, we the members of Class A will follow him wherever he decides to go. Midoriya is our friend. And Endeavor's like, it's dangerous outside, guys. There's a whole bunch of villains running everywhere. And then Nezu cuts in. He's like, haven't they grown up yet? I mean, they were just literally in a war. I thought it would be best if they teamed up since he didn't want to come back to UA. But he's allowed to come back now. And then Endeavor's like, what about the safety of the evacuees? He's talking about like the families of like the students that came over to UA to like live there as a precaution, against all the villains and All for One and everything that's out there right now post-war. And then going further, Nezu says the designated evacuation areas weren't only chosen based on square footage. We prepared it when we reinforced the school for the cultural festival, but we never ended up using it. The UA security barrier. So either this is just like letting Endeavor and the audience know that like, hey, if Izuku comes back to UA, it's gonna be okay. I know the whole reason he left was to not have All for One or the villains come after him, but it's okay. Even if that happens, we have the UA security barrier. So kind of just putting us at ease. Or we are in fact going to see this thing come into play, because once Izuku comes back to UA, it is in fact going to get raided by villains. So after this, we're picking up from the ending of the previous chapter where Class 1A has finally met up with Izuku at Kamino. And they're also taking care
care of the dictator villain that was there. And Izuku's like, everyone, why? And Uraraka says, because we're worried about you. And Izuku's like, I'm okay. Looking like a hardcore villain right now, by the way. That's why you shouldn't worry about me. Stay back. And Bakugo's like, that's good to hear, as expected of His Majesty, the successor of One for All. So after this, can you still keep smiling? You know, reference to like the All Might Nana symbol of peace thing. And Izuku's like, to be able to smile, for people to live in peace, I need to keep moving forward. So all of you get out of my way. Like Izuku getting pretty aggressive here with his classmates. But then Bakugo, Ida, and Uraraka are not backing down. And Bakugo's like, just try and make us, you All Might wannabe. And Ida says, we know you won't change your mind. Let's go, guys. And Uraraka's like, yeah, so this is amazing. It really does seem like we're going to have Izuku versus Class 1A here, especially like the ending narration here when it says clashing emotions, fierce classmates versus Class A begins. And I am beyond excited for this. This is something that I think most of us had wanted at some point. Like, what would happen if like this new super powerful Izuku were to go against Class 1A? And we're finally gonna get it here. Now, also another thing to take into consideration is that Izuku is like exhausted and, you know, not, you know, in the best mental health right now. So it's possible that like those might come into play here, and Class 1A straight up defeats Izuku. It's not gonna be easy and it's not guaranteed, but I think it will be competitive at the minimum, and it's not gonna be like a squash match the way that like Mirio versus Class 1A was. All right, let's talk about the title of this video, why Deku has to fight his friends as well as vice versa. And of course, I'm gonna go into what's going on in this chapter as well. So after the war ended, Izuku went into like a temporary coma, and in the coma, he had like a long conversation with the vestiges of One for All. And they basically went over what the rest of the series was going to be about. Izuku going after All for One and Shigaraki and taking them down once and for all. But of course, that's easier said than done. So after Izuku woke up from said coma, kind of had a paradigm shift within him. And that moment was like the beginning of the snowball effect that's going to lead us to what this chapter is about. But considering that Izuku is All for One's main target, since he has One for All, the main thing that he wants, he decided that he was going to have to take matters into his own hands and for the most part handle this by himself. And I say for the most part because he does allow the top three heroes, Endeavor, Hawks, and Best Jeanist, and All Might to assist him with this one final mission. But that's pretty much it, meaning that he has cut off every other single person in his life in pursuit of this final goal. And that's exactly what he did, because at this point he just ghosts everyone. And it's even implied that he has All Might leave these pre-written letters for all of Class 1A. And in these letters, he finally reveals to everyone the big secret about One for All, the history of it, and why All for One is after him. And with that is the reason why he has to leave all of them, because he's going to put them at risk if he is around them. Because like we established, All for One only wants Izuku because he has One for All. And this weighs very heavy on Izuku because he saw firsthand in the war what happens to people that he cares about when All for One gets involved. And we're reminded of that in this chapter because in the sequence when Ojiro has Izuku wrapped up, he says, but if I'm around, I'll put everyone else in danger. All for One is going to take me away. That's why I left. And he's remembering moments in the war when Aizawa, Gran Torino, and Bakugo were all seriously maimed or injured by All for One. And when we, the fandom, were reading these chapters as they were being released, we really didn't even know what the fate of these characters were going to be. I mean, we assumed that Bakugo was going to live, but a lot of us, including myself, thought that Gran Torino was probably dead. So to stop that from ever happening again, Izuku has decided to just remove everyone he cares about from his life and to just exile himself until the job is done. And in this exile, he had become like a one-man army, like pseudo-vigilante, taking care of as many of the villains that broke out of Tartarus that are in cahoots with All for One as he could, hoping that along the way, this will lead him to All for One. And at a point, it almost does, but it's revealed that All for One is just always one step ahead of Izuku. And over time, this extremely hectic lifestyle that Izuku has adopted slowly started to change him. You yourself can see it happening real time. If you read from like chapter 306 to the current chapter, you can see Izuku's metamorphosis into what he is now. And it's kind of like a hardened, obsessed version of Izuku that has like this unintentional villainous aesthetic. And that comes from the lifestyle that he's been living, because it's implied that he's been taking like no breaks and he's just been going from like danger sense to danger sense. I mean, it's even mentioned by Kaminari in this chapter that like he needs to take a bath. So yeah, his hygiene is suffering as well. And while all this was happening, Class 1A finally took it upon themselves to take some action and to bring their friend back. So they wind up orchestrating this meeting with Nezu and Endeavor, and with the latter's help, they're able to track down Izuku's location. And in the previous chapter, they eventually find him, and that leads us to this chapter. And here we see all of Class 1A trying to forcefully take Izuku back. Because as we've established, he's not going to willingly go back, because he's like in this manic, obsessed state right now. And he's fully convinced himself that unless he takes care of All for One and finishes all of this by himself, that he can't go back to his normal life. In fact, he can't even smile until the job is done. So that's why we see in this chapter Izuku is pretty much fighting to run away from his friends here, because he feels that even just being around them in this moment is already enough to put their lives at risk. So that being said, he's definitely not going back to UA where more lives are at risk. But Class 1A isn't in a manic state, and they're probably seeing things more clearly than Izuku is. So this is why we see them forcefully trying to bring him back, especially now that they got confirmation from Nezu in the previous chapter. And all of that together gives us this great chapter, which is probably the only time in the series where we're ever going to get to see Izuku fighting against Class 1A, which is something that I've personally wanted for a while now, or at least since Izuku started to seriously progress in power. But also, this is the deepest that a fight between them is ever going to go. I don't really think this fight is ever going to progress any more than like a cat and mouse type thing. I highly doubt they're going to be like exchanging blows or anything like that. I mean, maybe in the next chapter we'll see Bakugo try to physically take him down with some explosions or something. And it's possible that we also might see Ida, get a little physical with him. But aside from that, I'm thinking that this altercation is going to be light on the violence. And that's fine, because it doesn't really need it, and it would be kind of uncharacteristic of everyone if that did happen, aside from like Bakugo. And another little fun thing that we're seeing in this chapter is that the Class 1A students that are on Spotlight in this chapter are all getting like their own little moments and a way to relate back to Izuku. They'll come across Izuku, they'll try to stop him from moving with their own, move set. And then they'll be like, hey, remember that time when we had that one moment in the series? Wasn't that fun? Come back now. And it made me think that like, oh, well, I guess Izuku did have at least one moment with everyone from Class 1A. And I get that it's kind of difficult to manage over 20 characters in a series, but I appreciate that there's at least one little moment there that can be called back here and give them all mutual motivation. This is also another way to put on spotlight the improvements that Class 1A has made as well, because obviously we don't get to see these characters a lot. Going back to what I said about it's difficult to handle over 20 characters and give them all arcs and progression and whatnot, but I think Horikoshi is handling it well here. Like, this isn't One Piece. We're not gonna get, 30 chapters dedicated to just all the ancillary characters. And then coming to the end of the chapter, we're seeing him encounter like Shoto and Tsuyu, which shows that there's still going to be more to this sequence, especially with the ending narration here that says, headed to the versus Class 1A's climax, meaning it's not over yet, especially since we haven't seen Ida and Bakugo like get their hands dirty with Izuku. So where's all of this headed? Well, I'm assuming that Class 1A is going to be successful here in subduing Izuku. And while he is nigh overpowered at this point, he's still very exhausted. Like we talked about, he's living this crazy, manic, unsustainable lifestyle, so he's not at peak performance here, while they're all pretty fresh for the most part. And Bakugo also briefed them on what his quirks were. I mean, he's not aware of Fa-Jin and whatever the second user's quirk is, because that information wasn't available in the One for All quirk users notebook that All Might gave Bakugo and Izuku a couple arcs back. But yeah, I fully expect them to bring him back, and then that's probably going to lead us into the beginning of the final like long arc of the series maybe. So the chapter opens up with Class 1A taking care of the dictator villain. I guess that just gives these characters something to do. But then we're seeing a car pull up, the very same car that we saw at the end of the previous chapter, and it turns out that it's Endeavor. And that's interesting because some of us thought that that was All Might.
because their cars look very similar, which means that we still don't know what happened to All Might after Izuku left him and it was revealed that Stain was behind the wall near him. But once Endeavor meets up with the students, he tells Kirishima that he wants to search the area with Hawks and the others. Kirishima's like, there's so many things I wanted to say to him, referring to Izuku. Now, what are those things? Well, I'm assuming it probably has something to do with friendship, why he respects him, and how they relate to each other. But also remember this, because I'm pretty sure this is going to happen at some point. Kirishima is for sure going to get his moment. But then we're coming to Shoto continuing to try to capture Izuku with his ice. And then he's like, hey, Midoriya, this could all be a part of All For One's plan. While we're all here, this could be his opportunity to attack UA. And it's completely understandable that Shoto would think this, because that's kind of been like a recurring theme since the war ended. All For One is now this hyper diabolical genius. Not saying that he wasn't always, but it wasn't always hammered home the way that it is now. And that he's predicted everything that's going to happen up until this point. He knew that Izuku was going to descend into this manic state. So like I said, understandable that Shoto would think that maybe his ultimate plan here is to attack UA. And I mean, it could be, but we, the audience, know that what All For One ultimately wants is one for all from Izuku. So it seems like that's priority number one, and maybe attacking UA, comes afterwards. And that brings us to the next part of this sequence, because that's what Izuku was thinking, because he's remembering both All Might and All For One saying like, you're next. Not UA is next, you, Izuku. And he's like, this fight is between One For All and All For One. You guys can't keep up. I'm the main character, you're just extras here. You're just collateral at this point. And that angers Shoto, and he's like, oh yeah? Alright, well, see me in a couple pages. So then Tsuyu and Mineta step up and try to capture Izuku as well, but they both fail, and this leads to Izuku activating a faux 100% slingshot. And right before he launches himself, we see Uraraka coming in trying to stop him, but he barely just gets past her and launches himself. At this point, it seems like he's successfully escaped, because faux 100% slingshot, that's crazy. And we're definitely going to see how crazy it is, because after Uraraka misses him, it reveals beneath her that Class 1A has set up this elaborate ice ramp, minecart, roller coaster thing. You can't even make out everyone that's involved here, but you can see that Tokoyami, Shoji, Koda, Sato are giving it an initial push, and it turns out what they're pushing is Shoto and Bakugo, who themselves are pushing this giant acid blob that was created by Ashido. So they get pushed into the ramp, and then Shoto does the flash freeze heat wave as a propulsion to shoot them off of it. Then in midair, they're converging with Uraraka, who's falling from trying to get Izuku, and she slaps the acid, making it 0G. Then Bakugo, who is still on it, does his explosive speed turbo cluster as more propulsion on top of what Todoroki has already established. And while this is happening, he says, Deku, there's so many things I want to say to you. No, there's so many things I have to say to you. So just like Kirishima and Uraraka, I'm pretty sure, maybe in the previous chapter, establishing that Bakugo, more than anyone, is going to have his moment with Izuku, and I'll talk about that at the end of the video. But then he says, but the one who has the body to withstand such speed other than you, Izuku, is, and then it turns out that inside of the acid was Ida the whole time. And then Ida launches himself on top of all of the momentum that was already established, and then doing this allows him to finally grab Izuku's hand. So like I said, that is insane how fast Izuku is off of slingshotting himself with faux 100%, that it took all of this from Class 1A just to grab him. And as this happened, we see the second user of One For All speaking. And I guess this is the continuation to what he said a couple chapters back. And he says, if there is anyone who could complete the current Deku, it would be the people who are willing to run alongside him. So back when he was initially setting this dialogue up, we saw Bakugo in the following panel, and I thought, oh, he was directly referring to Bakugo possibly, which was interesting, because of all of his infamous possible ties to the second user. But now that he's saying this, turns out that he's not talking about Bakugo, but he's just talking about his friends in general, I guess. Because here, it's clearly Ida, but the ones who are willing to run alongside him, it's, you know, pretty much all of his close friends. Totally understandable. I mean, the vestiges, I assume, are aware somewhat of his close relationships at the minimum. So yeah, no direct connection to Bakugo, at least yet. Not saying it's guaranteed that there is going to be, but I mean, come on, let's just keep stirring the pot as long as we can. And we're coming to the last page here, and they're both crying, and Ida, talking to Izuku, is like, sticking your nose in other people's business is what makes a true hero, right? A call back to their moment in the Stain arc. And this causes them both to cry, and that's where the chapter ends. So what I think is going to happen after this is like what I've been talking about throughout the chapter. Everybody has their moments that they need with Izuku. Kirishima, Uraraka, and Bakugo. And I think at least Uraraka and Kirishima are going to get it in the next chapter, but I wouldn't be surprised if Bakugo and Izuku get their own chapter dedicated to their moment. This is like maybe how the arc ends, with Bakugo just putting all of his cards on the table and just saying everything that he's ever wanted to say to Izuku, and then maybe even vice versa. And maybe that causes Izuku to come to a better mental state, and then he decides to come back after that, maybe. I think that would be a pretty interesting and satisfying way to end this arc, and one that I'm sure most of the community would be on board with. So it seems like we have, 1, 2, maybe 3 chapters at the most of this Class 1A trying to capture Izuku extended sequence here. So in the previous chapter, Class 1A did this like elaborate propulsion combo to be able to catch up to Izuku, who had launched himself in a slingshot using full 100% in an attempt to get away with them. But doing what they did, they were able to have Ida catch up to Izuku and grab his hand. And that brings us to where we are right now, where we see Izuku saying, even though I need to let go, I can't muster the strength. That's because he's like completely exhausted right now, and we're seeing him reaching his breaking point. Throughout this arc, we've seen Izuku burning the candle at both ends and living like this hectic, manic lifestyle, essentially trying to speed run the symbol of peace, where it's also implied that like he hasn't been taking breaks or resting or sleeping or anything like that. So naturally, he's on borrowed time, and we see that time running out here. So then Uraraka releases her a quirk that she had applied to Ida in the previous chapter, and this causes him and Izuku to free fall, and Ida starts to get worried about if they're going to be able to make a safe landing or not. And then out of nowhere, Kirishima shows up and puts himself to use and catches both of them. This is a bit of a surprise because in the previous chapter, Kirishima was instructed by Endeavor to go assist Hawks securing the civilians. But also, Kirishima was kind of complaining about that because he had things he wanted to say to Izuku, and he also felt like he wasn't as capable as the other students. So I guess off panel, Endeavor changed his mind and told Kirishima that he could go assist with recovering Izuku. But as for the thing that he wanted to say to him, turns out to be him asking Izuku if he is the kid from the sludge villain incident. Because apparently he had heard about this story when it happened. That's understandable, but what's a little clunky, I guess, is him bringing this up now. But I guess I see what Horikoshi is going for here. Kirishima and Izuku haven't really had like a lot of bonding, and I guess they don't really have a lot of moments or things to reminisce about. So I guess this is just a way for Kirishima to stay relevant and also having some kind of connection to Izuku. And also this is a way to explain the reasoning for their actions here, because after this he's like, think that your attitude from back then is the key to all that's happening now. So at this point, Izuku is further about to break down, and it seems like they're actually going to be able to take him back to UA with them. But then he says, I'd love to come back, but it's just too dangerous, and there's like a lot of people at UA, and I don't want to cause them any more trouble. And then we come to the major significance of this chapter, something that I think makes it one of the most important chapters in the series quite easily, because Bakugo steps up to Izuku and just straight up wears his heart on his sleeve here, and finally reveals the truth to Izuku about how he feels about him and why their relationship is the way that it is. And he's like, I always looked down on you because you were quirkless. You were always far behind me, yet I felt that you were somehow miles ahead of me. I hated that. I didn't want to feel like that, and I didn't want to recognize that. So even as a child, Bakugo instantly knew that there was some serious potential to Izuku. Potential that maybe even surpassed Bakugo's, which is obviously exceptional. And he says, "It's why I grew so distant from you and always tried to beat you down. I opposed you and tried to show my superiority over you, but I always lost. Even after entering UA, nothing went as I thought it would. I spent all my days trying to figure out your strengths and weaknesses. It probably doesn't mean anything telling you all this, but that's what I really think." And that's ironic, of course, because this means everything to Izuku. This is one of the most important things he's ever wanted to hear in his life. And then to cap all this off, he then says, "Izuku, I'm sorry for everything I've done up until now." So that was it. You know, he spilled the beans, but then he also called him Izuku. I think that's the first time he's ever called him by his real name. And now on top of that, he said he was sorry. I think that's the first time for that as well. But he continues to say that the path you took as the successor of One for All is exactly what All Might did. Your choices weren't misguided at all. But as of now, you can barely stand on your own, and your ideals alone can only take you so far. If you ever encounter a road bump, you can always count on us. In order to surpass All Might, we would all have to protect UA and the civilians in there together. It's the only way. And then it appears that Izuku is about to lose consciousness, and the last thing that he's able to say is, "Guys, in the previous chapter I said this fight is between One for All and All for One. You all can't keep up. Look, I'm sorry I said that, guys. I didn't mean it." And then he falls and Bakugo catches him and he's like, "I know." So this is another huge moment, and I'm sure a lot of you went crazy over this. So then I guess we have like a short time skip of them bringing Izuku back to UA, and we see like the barrier is active. But then randomly 13 is there with her helmet off. This is the first time we're seeing what she looks like, and she kind of looks like a student. She's giving like a brief update on what's been going on, but she says the ones remaining outside are anti-hero vigilantes and an extremist that has become violent alongside the prison escapees. So maybe that's like the next opponent that they're all going to collectively face as like a reunited team or something. And then she says the number of anti-hero civilians entering each evacuation center due to exhaustion is increasing, and that the solo journey that you did, Izuku, really helped the heroes and the police. So that's nice. It's showing that like what Izuku did was not all for naught. Like he did put in some serious work and made somewhat of a difference despite, you know, him losing himself along the way. But then they also mentioned that the security system on UA connects to Shiketsu somehow. So that's interesting. I wonder to what capacity and how it works exactly. But also I think Shiketsu being name dropped here means that they're for sure gonna come back. I mean, we are final act, so I'm assuming it's gonna be sooner or later. But then as Izuku continues to approach UA, we see like all of these civilians standing outside saying that like, "Oh, the rumor about that boy that Shigaraki's after, it's him, isn't it? Don't bring him in here. You know, the principal said that we were all gonna be safe here, and if you bring him in here, then we're not gonna be safe. Go hide him somewhere else." But then Uraraka steps up, you know, the great person that she is, and she's like, "You know what, don't worry about them." And she grabs Izuku's hand. She's like, "Look, we all made this possible for you to come back, and we're not going to let go of you anymore." It's like, who will save the heroes when they're the ones in trouble? Referring to Izuku, obviously, and them helping him. And in the final panel, we see like Uraraka like looking seriously at the civilians, I guess, saying like, "No, you're going to accept him." So since we got the spoilers Thursday, I have not watched anyone else's content regarding this chapter or have listened to their takes on things that have happened within it. The only person I've talked to is Turtle Quirk, and that was simply just because of the coincidence that we uploaded at the same time on Thursday and had the very same suspicions. I did this because I didn't want to influence my decisions in any way. I wanted to come into this video as pure as possible, and to be honest, at first I wasn't really too into doing this review because I basically had talked about everything in my spoilers video on Thursday. But as I was rereading this chapter, I started thinking and I started backtracking, and my mind was re-blown. Like, I'm honestly almost at a loss for words, which is very rare for me, and it's like Horikoshi is truly a great writer, and I know most of us already knew that, but there was like a lot riding on this traitor storyline in my opinion, considering that it was set up so early on in the series and it was so hardly ever touched on, and there was so many different suspects. And after reading this chapter and, you know, going back and everything, not only has Horikoshi pulled it off, but but he crushed it. Like, I am so happy that he was able to pull this off, because I was a little worried. And honestly, a lot of you thought that he like straight up dropped the storyline or forgot about it. But now I could say with certainty that Nezu is absolutely the traitor, and he's a near perfect candidate for being a traitor within this series, because there was so much misdirection and hiding in plain sight this whole entire time. And I'm just so impressed by this, because we recently just got over a traitor storyline in One Piece. No worries, I'm not going to spoil anything, but it was way less apparent, or even go back and backtrack and to have it all make sense the way that the traitor storyline makes sense in My Hero. And I'm definitely not saying Horikoshi is a better writer than Oda, or vice versa, or anything like that. I'm just simply saying that Horikoshi has truly crushed this, and I know that it hasn't absolutely been confirmed or said on the page or anything that he is the traitor yet, but I am so convinced that this is the case. And after what I'm going to be talking about here, I hope you can see the same. And also, one more thing, let me say that there's obviously way more stuff that happens in this chapter. You know, with Ochako stepping up and defending Izuku. If you've been following my coverage of My Hero, you know that Ochako is one of my favorite characters, and I'm on board for this, and I love that she's coming to one of her big character arcs in the next chapter probably. But unfortunately, that is just being completely overshadowed by this Nezu reveal here, and that's mainly all I really want to talk about. Also, Monoma has like a nice little face moment in this chapter, so that's cool. But anyway, it opens up with like a flashback to Ida incorrectly predicting that Izuku coming back to UA is going to calm the civilians down, because obviously we're seeing that it did quite the opposite. And then Nezu says UA boasts the greatest defense technology in the whole nation. Its security is comparable to the defense capabilities of Tartarus, and that was already like a red flag right there. We all know what happened to Tartarus. I mean, even the students do, because Momo brings it up immediately. She's like, you know, Tartarus was easily destroyed by Shigaraki. And then Nezu says UA was also broken into last year. We even witnessed the terror of Shigaraki firsthand. And when he said that, the cogs started moving in my brain again, and I was thinking, like, because UA was like the first, you know, big part of the series, which also was like the catalyst for this whole traitor storyline. Even though it wasn't mentioned until much later on, the seed was certainly planted during this stretch of chapters. I mean, even if you go back to all of the old traitor videos on YouTube, most of their information and clues are coming from the USJ incident. But another thing about those videos is that I would say about 90% of them do not suspect Nezu being the traitor. And hey, understandable, because even your boy definitely did not suspect that. I thought it was Hagakure for the longest time, and it was me thinking about USJ that really sealed the deal for me, because I was thinking like, okay, so Shigaraki breaks into with his, you know, ragtag group of makeshift villains, and I was thinking, okay, so how does that situation get resolved? All Might shows up, Goku style, saves everyone. You know, awesome, one of my favorite moments in the series, one of my favorite moments in any battle manga / anime ever. But then I was thinking, like, why does he show up late? And then it was just, oh my god, he was late because Nezu prevented him from going there. And then I went back and reread chapter 15, and it all but confirms that it was Nezu the whole time, right in front of our faces. So chapter 15 opens up with us seeing All Might like having this internal monologue, and he's like, I can't seem to contact 13 or Aizawa. Good reasons or not, I should put my hero work ahead of teaching. That was quite foolish. What do I tell them when I show up at the end? Anyway, I should be fine in another 10 minutes, thinking that, like, you know, I could just not go to the USA and just show up despite, you know, not being able to get in contact with the other teachers. But then All Might being All Might, it's like, no, what am I thinking? I'm going. And as he's about to go to USJ, Nezu shows up right there at the door and says, hold on, as if Nezu was waiting there the whole time to make sure that All Might wouldn't leave. And what goes on to happen in this sequence is essentially Nezu talk no jutsus All Might into staying and relaxing. Like, he goes out of his way to make sure that All Might does not leave that room. Like, he's softening up the couch,
He's getting tea ready for him. And like most of us, I'm sure, when I was first reading / watching this, I just thought, you know, it's just a coincidence. You know, Nezu shows up. He has the best interest in All Might. We assume Nezu himself doesn't know what's going on at USJ. So it's just, you know, like an unfortunate circumstance. Nothing malicious behind it because, you know, why would we suspect Nezu of being the traitor? But no, this whole time it was quite the opposite. And it was at this point where I was just totally surrendered to Horikoshi and finally accepted him as one of the greatest mangakas ever. I mean, that might be controversial, but it's really not as common as you would think that a story is this well crafted and compelling as My Hero Academia is. Obviously, it's not perfect and it has a lot of issues just like every other series, but this is just masterful in my opinion.
So the name of chapter 325 is Connected by One for All. The chapter opens with a panel of Kota's sneakers. Mineta also tries to run towards Deku, but Ida stops him, saying that this is not their turn. Kota calls Deku Midoriya Ni-chan and apologizes for being paralyzed with fear. He also says that he felt inspired when he saw the giant woman talking about how Deku protected her. He says that everything will be alright so he can stop crying. So I guess it's immediately picking up from the end of the previous chapter where we saw the large furry lady and Kota like approach Izuku, who was like on his knees after Uraraka's big profound speech. And as for him saying paralyzed with fear, I guess that means like him in the crowd not speaking up. Like, it's okay. What are you, like 6 years old or something? And during the training camp arc, it seems like Horikoshi wrote Kota to have like the intelligence of one of like class A or something. But also just further showing how he's grown so much closer to Izuku since the training camp arc and that whole encounter with Muscular. The giant woman cries, saying that many shelters rejected her because of her quirk. She says she was very lucky to find Deku, and thanks to him calling him Mr. Crybaby Hero. The two of them give Deku a hug. The old man from the first chapter starts defending Deku, saying that the other civilians are too hysterical, and obviously Deku doesn't want to stay there just resting forever. He kept fighting because there was a lack of heroes and now he needs to take a break. So that's interesting. The old man from the first chapter, I wonder if they're referring to the Mudkip guy. And I say the Mudkip guy because, you know. But this guy was kind of like an Easter egg, I guess, in the previous chapter. Like, towards the end of it, we see him, like, watching. And also, I guess he doesn't remember that, like, oh, hey, you're that kid that I randomly talked to last year, or almost 2 years ago. He goes on to say that because they are the spectators, the civilians have gotten used to seeing All Might fighting, and have forgotten that that hero had a heart. He says that after the war, many heroes gave up, so those that are left must have an unwavering determination. He ends his speech by asking, how long are we planning to stay as mere spectators? So if this is in fact the Mudkip guy, it's just so interesting how Horikoshi has decided to use this character. Like 324 chapters later, he's gonna come back and give this little speech defending Izuku. I think that's cool. I like, you know, little things like that. And I also like the line about they're used to seeing All Might, and makes sense because All Might was like the standard hero for a lot of these people's entire lives, I guess. And also he was, you know, close to perfection. So anything less than that is, you know, gonna cause this kind of reaction, I suppose. The civilian who opposed Deku in the last chapter says that some people are calling him All for One's henchman, others the hero's greatest weapon, and he was confused by all of it. He asked Deku if after resting in UA, he will be able to turn things back to normal, and Deku replies that they will all fight for it. Ectoplasm goes to meet Endeavor, Hawks, and Shoto, who are outside UA. He asks if they heard Uravity's speech, and tells them to come in because they will not want to miss what's happening right now. Endeavor is blaming himself, saying that he just made Deku wander around with no progress. Hawks corrects him, saying that the progress is right in front of their eyes. He says that One for All is a power formed by the connection between people. Because of it, All Might connected with Midoriya, Midoriya connected with Class A, and Uraraka connected the civilians to Midoriya. I mean, that is true, but doesn't necessarily have to be one for all to make that connection there, Hawks. I get what you're saying, bruh, but maybe jumping through a little hoops to get there. What comes next is a beautiful double spread of the civilians handing out umbrellas to all of the students. Hawks is saying that if from now on each person starts thinking about the whole, a society where heroes have all the time in the world will surely arise. So that's a nice little callback to what I guess is still essentially Hawks' main motivation. A society where heroes have all the time in the world, which is basically like Hawks' nonchalant way of saying the closest thing we can have to peace. Shoto reminds Endeavor that they need to stop Toya together. Endeavor agrees. Just written like that is pretty funny because it probably doesn't play out exactly like that on the page. Just the way this is written, it's like, hey Endeavor, don't forget that we need to stop Toya together. I agree. Nezu is on the phone with Aizawa. He says that Aizawa's class was able to do what Nezu himself couldn't, and Aizawa asks him to tell Ida that he did a great job. Nezu asks about his leg, and Aizawa says that he hasn't gotten used to it as much as Mirko. We see a panel of his prosthetic leg. Alright, so that's a nice little development with Aizawa here. He did in fact get a prosthetic. If you need a refresher, that's because Shigaraki shot Aizawa with one of those quirk destroying bullets, like kind of like the same that Mirio was shot with. But Aizawa, knowing what was going to happen, like cut his leg off before it could spread to his quirk factor. Kurogiri is being kept in the central hospital. Doctors are trying to get him to talk, but according to Aizawa, there has been no progress yet. Nezu says that even if it is small, there is still a spark of hope. Okay, so confirmation that Kurogiri is still in the hospital and he's not with the villains or whatever, or he wasn't involved in the Tartarus break, because he is pictured in that chapter. I think it's like 298, 297, one of those chapters. And since then, I guess we've been wondering like what was going on with Kurogiri, but he is still there and still a kind of intriguing plot line, I suppose, because I do think that there's a chance we might see Shirakumo come back, right? I mean, why go through all the trouble of having that whole sequence that we just got over in season 5? Like Aizawa trying to pull Shirakumo through Kurogiri. If the whole point of that was for Shirakumo to just come back for a second to tell them hospital, that would make that plot line even more depressing than it already is, in my opinion. But since this is being mentioned here, I think the percentage of Shirakumo coming back has increased. Aizawa says that the search for Toga continues and that they have discovered her maximum transformation time. As a countermeasure, they make all refugees go through a period of isolation before they actually enter UA to ensure that she will not infiltrate. Aizawa says that UA is their fortress and that now is the time for revenge. So that's an awesome idea, and honestly this should have been implicated maybe a couple months ago, but better late than never, I suppose. And yeah, I'm sure this is reminding you of Quarantine, which I'm sure inspired Horikoshi with this idea. But I wonder if this is how Toga is reintroduced into the story, other than through flashbacks and stuff. Like she's randomly just caught in one of these countermeasures possibly, but that would kind of go against One For All's like master 3 steps ahead strategy, unless she's not included in it, because there's kind of implications that there might be like a villain Cold War going on maybe. The last panel of the chapter shows All Might standing near the UA barrier with a worried face. End of chapter. Alright, finally getting an update on All Might here. I'm pretty sure we haven't seen him since his whole falling out with Izuku, and then it was revealed that Stain was like behind a wall near him, and we've been speculating back and forth since then, like what's going on with All Might. Is Stain going to do something with him? Is Stain going to take him out? Is Stain going to talk to him? And it turns out that he's not dead, and I guess okay too. I mean, he has a worried face, but not mentioning that he's injured or anything. So we got the spoilers early this week, and this chapter seems like it's going to be incredible, so let's get into it. The chapter begins with All Might driving his car while remembering his last conversation with Deku. He goes to Kamino, where the Deku versus Class A took place, and sees part of his mask laying on the ground. So the part of the mask is like the iconic jaw piece thing. He then looks at his own statue and remembers his talk with Aizawa right before the war, when Aizawa said that just by being alive he is already helping many people, but then he himself says that he can't do anything for his suffering disciple and that he's just holding everyone back. This is when Stain appears, pointing his sword at All Might and saying that these words are an insult to a great hero. So yeah, this is it. Finally, Stain is meeting All Might. And I'm just so beyond excited for this meeting. Like, when I first saw the leaks on Twitter, it was just like an instant hit of euphoria. Like, I've been looking forward to this for so long, since essentially I started following the series because, you know, it's kind of set up in season 2. And that being said, it took quite a while to get here. But better late than never, and it actually kind of works out maybe even better this way. I mean, of course, I would have liked for Stain to have met All Might before he was completely nerfed, but this makes it just as compelling, I think. And aside from season 2, it was also set up a few times in the story, like specifically with Tsukauchi trying to set up this meeting between All Might and Stain, but it like fell through, and also that portion of the manga was removed from the anime for some reason, as well as us seeing Stain in Tartarus when All for One is locked up. Not really sure about that, but given the way that season 5 has been chopped up, I'm continuing to see Bones' questionable decisions. But aside from all of that, we have been waiting for All Might to be touched on again in the story, because like a couple chapters back he had that falling out with Izuku, and it was revealed that Stain was like behind that wall near Stain, who we've been very interested in since he broke out of Tartarus, someone we haven't seen in action since season 2. So this is like all significant stuff, but I haven't read the rest of this summary or the translations yet because I wanted to save myself for this video, so we're going to be experiencing this together. All Might recognizes Stain and says that he couldn't talk to him on Tartarus as he wanted, but Stain doesn't know what he's talking about. All Might then realizes that he must not know about his thin form and introduces himself. Stain says that he is lying. All Might transforms briefly to prove it, but Stain continues to doubt. So yeah, in this instance, we see like All Might go into his muscular form for like a second, then like reverts out of it. He says that he is an imposter and asks why he came to the holy land of a hero to lie and dirty his name. All Might then says that maybe he was always lying, that he created an image for himself because he couldn't stand to see the injustices around him anymore. He says that the current state of the country, totally destroyed, is the end result of his efforts. He says that even though he put his life on the line, he couldn't help his disciple, and after that, he didn't even have the courage to talk to him at UA. He remembers the scene of the civilians handing the umbrellas to the students. Stain then jumps towards All Might as if he was going to attack him, but then actually pulls him out of the front of the statue because he saw a woman coming. They both hide, and he tells All Might to watch. This woman is the one All Might saved in Camino, who was trapped in the rubble of the building. She takes off the sign that says, "I am not here," starts to clean the statue. Stain says that what defined All Might was his smile and his courage, not his power, and that this is the only version of All Might he can accept. He says that the current state is not the end result of his efforts at all. They are still the middle part of a process. He says that the embers left by All Might have not been blown out by even the strongest of winds, and have been passed on to a group of people who have turned them into a huge fire that continues to grow. All Might begins to cry as he watches the lady. Stain says that he is unable to recognize All Might in that person right now, but if he really is the true hero he so admires, he should use the information Stain obtained on Tartarus and kill him, putting an end to the hero killer. He throws a knife on the ground near All Might, containing a piece of paper with information he talked about. He finishes by saying that this is all for the sake of a more just society, and All Might is still crying. The girl looks at the sky and realizes that the rain is stopping. End of chapter. So that was not what I expected. In my previous videos, coming into this, I had talked about how Stain wasn't exactly aware of All Might's true form, his thin form. And I was curious to how he was going to react to that, and I thought maybe he'd ridicule All Might or something, but I didn't even take into consideration that he wouldn't even recognize him and would actually not believe him, not even believing his claims that he is him. I mean, towards the end of this, I guess it's implied that Stain eventually does believe that he is All Might, but he ultimately just can't accept. And also, this is a very different Stain than what we're used to. This is probably the most grounded
Stain has ever been, right? I mean, granted, when we did see him in the story, he was at, the peak of his unhingedness. But now in this more intimate, personal moment, we're seeing another side of Stain, which isn't like this psychotic All Might zealot. Like somewhere deep down, there's like a real hero there, but he's obviously a foobar at this point. And I like the nod to him like saying that you should just kill me now, throwing the knife on the ground, because it goes back to one of his iconic sayings, which is like, only All Might can kill me, only the true hero All Might is allowed to kill me. And also I like the lady civilian coming back into play, cleaning up the statue, because All Might saving her Camino obviously had a huge impact on her life, so her like cleaning up the statue is like the least she could do for this like godlike figure who saved her. And also just, adds that deeper layer of continuity to the world, which fleshes it out even more than it already was. But yeah, that was the All Might and Stain meeting, and it seems like this might be the end of it. I mean, I don't think it's going to be the end of Stain, but maybe the end of their like one-on-one confrontation possibly. And it's good. I mean, I obviously haven't read the full chapter yet, just going off of the summary and some panels, but definitely not what I was expecting. And honestly, I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe something more definitive than this, maybe something more straightforward. But again, this is good too. And it's different, not in a bad way. It's good to subvert expectations sometimes, as long as it doesn't, ruin the product. So at this point, I guess the next big meeting will be Stain and Izuku. Hopefully we'll have that reunion there. Or maybe all three of them, All Might, Izuku, and Stain will all have a little conversation maybe. But considering that, the way that Stain's temperament is in this chapter, I could see him, for sure being a future ally or pseudo ally to the heroes.
So we got the spoilers, and it seems like this is going to be one of those significant chapters that we get like after an arc is over, like these bridge expositional chapters. And this one specifically seems to be setting up the end game of the series. The title of the chapter is Rest. The chapter begins with all the 1A boys taking off Deku's clothes and giving him a bath and throwing him into the hot bath. So yeah, this whole opening sequence is pure fan service. I'm sure when this anime episode gets released, it's going to be like viral for sure. Bakugo approaches Deku and tells him that he still wants to become the number one, that they are still rivals, and throws water in his face. But just as he's about to call him Deku, he changes to Izuku. Deku himself laughs and says he doesn't need to force himself to do it every time. So that's actually something that I forgot about coming into this, and that is the Baku Deku paradigm shift that we've recently had. Like, what was it, 3 or 4 chapters back? Bakugo finally letting his guard down and coming to the full realization of who he is as a person and why his relationship with Izuku is the way that it is. And we, the readers, knew that after that chapter, nothing was really ever going to be the same, and it's being proved here for sure, because we see that Bakugo is actively trying to call him like Izuku instead of Deku, because Deku was originally like a bullying term for him. But he's also letting him know that like, hey, I'm still Bakugo, like I still want to be the best, and I'm still your rival for sure. I'm just not going to be a weird bully about it anymore. They get out of the bath and go to the communal area of the dorms. Deku asks about Uraraka, and they say that she went to sleep right after she finished her speech. Deku apologizes to everyone for the trouble he caused, and Ashido asks about One for All. They all start asking about several different things, but Shoto intervenes by telling them to let Deku sleep. Deku then says that he can't sleep until he apologizes to All Might because he said terrible things to him. Terrible things for Izuku to say. Far from terrible for the layman. He's about to make a call, but All Might arrives at the 1A dorm and apologizes for not being helpful at all. He then says that he has new information, and although he cannot say anything very specific yet, the next fight is near. Okay, so this is the beginning of what I was talking about, how the end game is being set up. And the new information that he's talking about is what he received from Stain in the previous chapter. At the end of it, Stain like threw him this knife with a note, and he said that it was information that he collected from his time in Tartarus. So it appears that whatever All Might learned through this indicates that the next fight is near. And the next fight is pretty much going to be the last one. Most of us by now know that we are in the final act of the series. He says that he will do everything everything he can to help, even if his body is weakened. Deku says that the tonkatsu lunchboxes he prepared were very important to him, and that he only started acting in that self-destructive way because he got further and further away from All Might. He finishes by saying that from now on, everyone will protect each other. All Might thanks him and says goodbye because he needs to go meet Endeavor. The students wonder why Endeavor doesn't come back to UA, but Shoto says that all the Dabi incident might make some refugees uncomfortable when they see his face. He says that possibly the civilians won't even want to see Shoto himself, considering he's Endeavor's son and Dabi's brother. He then says that he wants to break free from his bloodline shackles and prove to everyone that he is different. He wants his presence to make people feel at ease. Deku fell asleep right before this, and they comment that he finally seems to be relaxed. Jiro then calls the band together, Momo, Bakugo, Kaminari, and Tokoyami, and says that they are thinking of doing something to relieve everyone's stress, just like they did at the Culture Festival. They all seem happy with the idea and begin to reflect on their goal, that they can't make things go back to how they were before. They need to fix everything that was wrong before. To do this, they will need to do their best, and we see a whole page of them saying they will go beyond. We must go beyond. 76 million views this time. Cut to a scene of Hawks and Genist in a car. Hawks says that based on the information they've extracted from Dr. Garaki and the research they are doing with the Nomus, it is safe to say that it will take at least 2 months for Shigaraki's body to complete. Okay, so this is beginning to give us the timeline of where we're headed for the rest of the series, but there's more to it than 2 months, which we'll get into. But talking about completing Shigaraki here is interesting because, like, how is he being completed? Because if they have Yujiko, Garaki, then who is completing Shigaraki, and where is he being completed at? I'm sure all of these questions will be answered probably soon, but right now it's like, you know, what's going on with that? The villains that Deku defeated said that All For One asked them to get One For All to him before the body is complete. So I guess that answers it. All For One is doing it. I guess he has enough equipment, enough secondhand information from Yujiko. Maybe he has some notes too to complete this operation. And also he has many quirks, which I'm sure can help him with this. So if the heroes want to take the lead, they will need to attack in 1 month at most. I guess that's telling us that there is 1 month left within the story, or at least until we get to like the last 3 chapters or whatever. Then there could be like a time skip or something. But it seems like at this point we're gonna have 1 month of like training, maybe like the final training that they're gonna get, and just, you know, leading up to the penultimate arc. We might even get like an extra villain arc in there too. I don't want to get your hopes up, just saying it's a possibility. Endeavor is flying above them. They say they thought Stain's papers would help with new information, but it was basically a love letter to All Might. Actually, the information he got was on a chip hidden in the knife. It's the records from Tartarus' security system. End of chapter. That's pretty funny. That's almost One-esque, the writer of One Punch Man. So I guess that confirms that Stain for sure did accept that that was All Might by the end of the chapter. I mean, it was heavily implied beforehand, but this just seals the deal. And also the knife is pretty complex. It has like this like cell phone SIM card-esque compartment to it, and it has like a micro SD card in there. You wouldn't expect Stain to have something like this. But yeah, Tartarus' security system is on there. What does that mean? I'm not really sure. Maybe the security footage, maybe they're able to see all of the footage of All For One breaking out, and then from that they can figure out what he's trying to do. Not sure, we'll see what happens. The 328 spoilers are out, and this chapter is really hyped. I'm super excited about this one, so let's get into it. Title of the chapter is Connected. The chapter begins with a flashback to a month ago to the escape from Tartarus. One of the prisoners is excited because he will be able to get out of there and go back to chasing women. But then Stain shows up and kills him. Nice. He seems interested in acquiring information, so he goes straight to the monitoring room. When he gets there, he sees all the guards dead except for one. The only survivor is holding the security system records with all of the strength he has left. Like the one thing that Stain is pretty much looking for, this guy has. Like near death, he was gonna do everything to make sure that the security records from Tartarus would not fall into the hands of Shigaraki. Nothing else, just the security system records. But Stain goes there and takes them from him. The man says that this cannot fall into Shigaraki's hands and asks if Stain is a man or a beast. He replies by saying that he is a beast who fights for a just society. Stain is so cool. But basically what happened here is the guy's like, are you a hero or a villain? And Stain's like, I guess I'm an anti-villain. After leaving the monitoring room, he sees All For One gathering his followers and preparing to leave. I almost forgot this was a thing for a second. All For One does have like a new League of Villains B team, I guess. And they haven't been revealed yet, but we did see their silhouettes. And also, I don't know why I didn't think about this sooner, but this is also exactly what the main villain of One Piece does. But I wonder if we'll get a better glimpse of what these individuals look like, because I'm very interested. Stain decides to respect the wish of the man who just died and leaves on his own, jumping into the sea and swimming his way out. Alright, so that's the explanation for how Stain got out of Tartarus. That's extremely impressive. Fast forward a bit in time and we see All Might with Tsukauchi. After the conversation with Stain, he had gone to Tsukauchi to drop off the chip with the records. I think it was 2 chapters back. At the end of All Might's conversation with Stain throws him like this knife with a letter, and in the knife was like this compartment for like a micro SD card. Went to the students' dorms and now came back to see the information they had managed to acquire. Tsukauchi looks very tired with dark circles under his eyes and an unshaven beard. They start talking about how the invasion of Tartarus was only possible because All For One connected the consciousnesses of his real body with Shigaraki's, allowing a shockwave attack that disabled the security system. But All Might says that something seems weird because in One For All's case, the connection is usually one way only. The All Might of the Vestiges can get information from the outside world, but the real All Might doesn't get to know what the users were talking about inside the One For All world. So that's pretty interesting. And I did think about that at first, like what is the connection between Vestige All Might and real All Might? So I like that Horikoshi is kind of clearing that up here. One exception was when he was holding Midoriya's hand in the hospital room. In that case, he could vaguely sense what was being discussed inside the Vestiges. He felt that the synchronization rate had momentarily increased. This is exactly why they find it strange that All For One was able to connect with Shigaraki's body, even though his real body was trapped at a depth of 500 meters within the ocean. He must have used another method. So this makes me think like, okay, so what is the different method? Is there some kind of like receiver or something on Shigaraki? And I was like, what is on Shigaraki? Oh, the hands! It's his family's hands that are the receiver for All For One. Or at least in my opinion, it's obviously not confirmed yet. But it totally makes sense, right? All Might just said that when he touched Izuku, the synchronization rate had momentarily increased. So the hands of Shigaraki's deceased family are touching him, but they also have like this little bottom piece to them. And I always wondered like, what was the purpose of those things other than just like aesthetic that Yujiko put on there? But that end cap thing on the wrists might be like the receiver for All For One's mind Wi-Fi. This is pretty cool, I must say, making full use of Shigaraki and the family and the hands, because originally we just thought that he was using those hands as like a leash for Shigaraki in a way. But it turns out there's much more to it than that. But you also have to remember that this is like a premeditated plan by Yujiko and All For One. So they started considering that the shockwaves must have been used not only to knock out the system, but also to send a message. So they looked into the security system's records, and indeed, the electricity level meter formed something resembling a conversation, and from there they got some very important information. Shigaraki's body would be ready in 38 days. Sansa, Tsukauchi's assistant, is shocked. He says that this doesn't match up with what was said by the central hospital because the minimum resting time should be 2 months. All Might says he doesn't quite understand it either, but for now the results of the hospital's research will take a back seat. Taking this deadline set by All For One and calculating the time that has passed since the invasion of Tartarus, there are only 3 days left for Shigaraki's body to reach a perfect state. The focus shifts to a building with several flags around it, which seems to be the International Heroes headquarters. There, some big shots are discussing how it would be unwise to send too many heroes from different countries to Japan, as this would mess with the existing balance of power in these countries. However, the representative from Egypt says that Salam, the hero that appears in movie 3, was not happy with this decision. Similarly, the Singapore representative said that the big red dot, also from movie 3, wanted to help All Might with whatever he needs. So that's cool that we're getting some, cross-movie canon here. Next, one of the leaders said that he failed to stop one of his country's heroes. She set off toward Japan on her own and took a fleet with her. On the next page, we see a woman on top of a jet saying that she couldn't refuse the request because it was made directly by All Might. If her master is in trouble, there is no reason for her to hesitate. Her name is Star and Stripe. She is America's #1 hero. End of chapter. Wow, I did not expect this at all. So I was able to see a leaked panel of what Star and Stripe looks like, and it turns out that she is the silhouetted hero that I've been speculating about for months now. This silhouette made me think it was a guy, but what a twist, it's a big woman. And she kind of looks like a female All Might. And I'm just so excited about this because also she just seems extremely powerful because, she looks like All Might. So that's probably an indicator of power. But also it's being said here that she's on top of a jet. So she's just riding a jet. So her quirk is something outrageous. And, America's #1 hero. I don't know if that's necessarily a title as impressive as like Japan's #1 hero, because in this world it's implied Japan is like the top hero place. When it says that she's bringing a fleet with her, I think that means like other heroes might be coming too. Not like major ones, maybe some sidekicks, but I also think that she's bringing Electaplant with her because he was also silhouetted. So things are really getting interesting in the story, and I'm just so excited to see what's going to happen